Hello, and welcome back to our ninth lecture in our course on pagans and Christians. What I would like to do now at the start of this ninth lecture is to deal with the issue of Constantine and the organization of the imperial church. The imperial church, of course, was organized around imperial institutions, that is, bureaucratic institutions, those that had been begun by the Emperor Diocletian and his associates, the Tetrarchs. But the churches themselves, of course, had been in existence since apostolic times, going back to St. Peter, St. Paul, the early apostles and disciples of Christ. Now, what Constantine did, in effect, was to bring in the bishops of those churches and make them into a new hierarchy within the Roman imperial system. And so when I speak of the imperial church, it's not as if Constantine invented it or something like that. The churches obviously are, go back with in the whole tradition of having a bishop. All of that goes back right to the apostles. But what we're talking about now are the sorts of Roman legal and administrative institutions that Constantine could invest into the hands of the bishops. And what we're looking at, therefore, is the Emperor Constantine, his relationship with the bishops, and how both emperor and bishops together organized a new imperial Roman imperial-backed church after the conversion of Constantine in 312. This will also, of course, require us to look at two major events that help define the relationship between emperors and bishops, and those would be the building of the Christian capital of Constantinople and the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325. So let's first turn to Constantine's relationship with different bishops. In early 313 at Milan, of course, Constantine and his ally, the Emperor Licinius, who was married to the half-sister of Constantine and was in alliance with Constantine at this time, issued the Edict of Milan, the imperial edict called the Edict of Milan. It is recorded in Christian sources. It differs significantly from earlier reprieves that emperors had issued when they had halted persecutions. In earlier instances, pagan emperors, in effect, had carried out an act of clemency, that is, they spared the Christians from future persecutions. They temporarily halted the persecutions that had been going on. And this was done in the same light as when one would say a governor would give a reprieve to a criminal or to other kind of outcasts when an emperor is on his deathbed or an emperor feels that he should reconsider. It's essentially a pardon, and we looked at some of those yesterday. For instance, we saw the Edict of Serdica that had been issued by Galerius upon his deathbed that temporarily halted persecutions against the Christians. But the Edict of Milan, issued in 313 by Constantine and Licinius jointly, issued not only a halt to the persecutions, but defined Christianity now as a legal religion. It was couched in language in which the emperor and his ally Licinius said that all members of the Roman world were free to practice whatever faith they wished. Persecutions were to be halted. Property that had been confiscated from the Christians should be returned to them. The church institutions likewise should be returned to the bishops, and henceforth Christian churches and their clergy were under the legal protection of the imperial government. Okay, we read this yesterday. All of these legal rulings by Constantine were very important because this was a significant change, really a watershed change in the whole relationship of Christianity vis-a-vis the imperial government, as well as the relationship between the Emperor Constantine and the leadership of the Christian Church, that is the bishops, particularly the bishops of those apostolic sees, as they were called, SEES, that went back to the earliest missions of the apostles. So we're talking about the churches of Rome, of course, of Antioch, of Alexandria, of Jerusalem. Henceforth, bishops, according to Constantine, using Roman law, were constituted as an ordo, a legal class, a rank. Now, I've mentioned the word ordo in its plural form, ordines, in earlier parts of this course. An ordo is a clearly defined legal class. It is defined as those having certain rights and privileges. Obviously, it would include only Roman citizens. It is a carefully I suppose there could have been, maybe in fact were ordines that were of non-citizens, perhaps, but definitely in this instance, I'll have to think about that actually, if there would have been any ordines of non-citizens. The highest ordo in the early Roman world, in the Roman Republic, was the senatorial order. Okay, and then there would have been the equestrian order after that. The decurions were also an ordo. Roman imperial soldiers and officials of the late empire became legal classes as well. And these were not strictly economic and social as we would understand it today, which is we would base primarily on the question of income or wealth. It went beyond that. The Christian clergy now constituted an ordo, and it was in the ordines, that is, it was in the categories of those who were classified as the honestiores. What does that mean? Well, in Roman law, there was an important distinction that had evolved in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, a distinction between citizen civis and non-citizen peregrinus, that is, between Roman and provincial. And this had been replaced by a new distinction in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the honestiores, literally those who were more honored. And the humiliores would be the opposite of that, those who were kind of humble or more looked down upon. The word humus means the ground, so those who were humble, they were closer to the earth. What happened was that those classes who were the honestiores, the more honorable ranks, the honorable ordines, they got elevated and had all sorts of privileges. That might include tax exemptions, freedom from corporal punishment, special favors from the emperors, and the humiliores, the humble ones, were those fellows not so lucky. They perhaps would be subject to corporal punishment, even though they were Roman citizens. And from the 2nd century on, Roman jurists came to evolve a system that has often been called the law of dual penalties, especially in criminal proceedings in which the honestiores were favored. And this begins to approach something of the class distinctions that would become so rigid in the Middle Ages, and something more approachable to at least what we can understand, what we can relate to. The result of Constantine's conversion to Christianity was that bishops were now put in one of those honestiores ordines. They were very high up. They were on par with the imperial officials and imperial soldiers. Furthermore, Constantine invested in the bishops all sorts of powers that made the Christian bishops increasingly potential leaders in provincial cities who could displace the pagan decurion class. And this is very important. The decurion class were those families that ran the town councils and administered the cults of the cities that were so important to pagan worship. Now these were being replaced by the bishops. There were a series of rulings over a period of 30 years in which Constantine expanded the competence or the jurisdiction of episcopal courts, that is, the courts that were held by bishops. Originally, bishops had to adjudicate disputes only within their own congregations, but with Constantine, bishops began to acquire a competence over litigation and issues that went beyond the immediate Christian community. What were some examples of this? Well, one would be any kind of issue that involved oaths, taking of an oath before God, or in the pagan case, to the divine. That would include various types of law dealing with marriages, even with contracts, with inheritance. This would involve even issues involving trade. Bishops could rule on these cases, especially if both litigants were Christian. In many instances, if one litigant was Christian and one was pagan, under certain circumstances, the Christian litigant could argue or could appeal to have a decision or a case transferred from the imperial to the episcopal court. That is, to get a bishop to rule on it. There were a number of issues of customary or local law in the cities of the Roman world, and these varied from city to city. It was now often to the advantage of litigants, pagan and Christian alike, to bring their cases before bishops, who were in effect administering a version of imperial law. Also, with the issue of freeing of slaves. Under Constantine, there was a new legal procedure known as the manumitio in ecclesia, that is, the manumission in the church, where before something like that had to be ratified or had to be at least signed off on in some way by a Roman magistrate. Now that could be done before a bishop in church, and it would be legally binding. So you get the idea. The bishops are now kind of, in some ways, beginning to displace that local decurion class. Some scholars have often seen this as a way of the emperor losing power, creating an institution within the Roman Empire, that is the church, gaining legal powers. And he kind of being, looking at power as a sort of zero-sum game, then the emperor loses out in power. But this is a total overstatement. Constantine certainly invested powers in the bishops that were very similar in many ways to powers once executed and administered by pagan decurions. But there was very, very little doubt as to who was the senior partner in this legal arrangement. The emperor was the font of all patronage. He had a vast amount of power behind him with the army and, of course, the bureaucracy. He had the power of Roman law. Therefore, the bishops understood very early and very clearly that the emperor was the senior partner in this legal arrangement, and the emperor wasn't giving away anything that was really vital to himself. In fact, in many ways, he was turning over to the bishops powers that he just didn't have sufficient imperial administrators or officers to handle. The way the Roman world had always been run was by co-opting local elites. And what Constantine, in effect, was doing was creating a Christian local elite and co-opting them into imperial service. There were other ways that the emperor could change the religious makeup of the Roman Empire. Constantine, for instance, could legislate in favor of those subjects who were Christians. Roman soldiers and officers who embraced the new faith were given Sundays off. There was a law in 326 that allowed that. Towns that converted to Christianity also would be given the status of a city, which came along with certain privileges. We have an inscription, for instance, from a town in Asia Minor. It was a satellite town to the city of Amorium, which is a city actually currently being excavated by one Christopher Lightfoot, which is the late Roman Byzantine city that he's looking at. And this little community named Orchistus really was probably just nothing more than a glorified village. But the citizens of that town petitioned the emperor and said, everyone here has converted to Christianity. Could you grant us civic status? That is the status of a city. And what they really wanted was to be free from Amorium, which was nearby. You can kind of see Orchistus is not actually even on this map, but Amorium is right over here. Orchistus is just outside of it. See, it's so small, it's not even on this map. What they really wanted was to be free from Amorium so that they could run their own events. Okay, they could now be a city in their own right. And Constantine, because of the fact that they had converted to Christianity en masse, said yes, and you get a bishop too. You now can have your municipal institutions, you can have your own taxes and so on. And so this was an incentive for many cities to convert. A.D. Lee, in his very good source book on pagans and Christians in late antiquity, says the following about this situation. Orchistus was a community in Phrygia, Asia Minor, which at some point in the preceding century, for some reasons unknown, had been demoted from the status of an independent city to that of a village, governed and exploited by the neighboring city of Nicolea. Soon after his defeat of Licinius in 324 and acquisition of the eastern provinces, Emperor Constantine received a petition from the Orchistans seeking restoration of their former status. The emperor's response to this and a subsequent petition concerning continuing financial obligations to Nicolea shed light on many aspects of Roman administration and society, but are of particular interest because the arguments deployed by the Orchistans in their efforts to regain their status as an independent city included an appeal on the basis of their Christianity. The community claims to be wholly Christian and is aware that this is likely to carry weight in the emperor's deliberations, an expectation that proves to be fully justified. Although the claim to be wholly Christian should not be taken literally, there must have been substantial numbers of Christians in the community, while their appeal to this feature implies, though, that it was unusual compared with other communities in Central Asia Minor at this time. In other words, when they say 100%, obviously it wasn't really 100%. There must have been still some pagans there, but nevertheless, there must have been substantial Christians, and that is an exception That the idea is that it's somehow different than the other communities around them. Chastagnon in 1981, or probably its French name, so Chastignon, has raised the possibility that Orchistus may be the unnamed Christian community in Phrygia with which Diocletian dealt severely during his persecutions, which we read about in Eusebius and Lactantius, which would then be a likely context for Orchistus to lose its city status. In any event, this is the imperial response that was given from Constantine to Ablabius, the Praetorian prefect, regarding Orchistus. Greetings, Ablabius, most dear to us. The inhabitants of Orchistus, henceforth a town and city, have presented a pleasing opportunity for our munificence, most dear and pleasing Ablabius. For to those like us who are eager to establish new cities, to improve long-established ones, or to restore lifeless ones, what they are seeking was most welcome. For they declared that their village flourished with the splendor of a town in the period of a former age, so that it was adorned with the symbols of authority, that is, the fasces of annual magistrates, had numerous city councillors, and was filled with a multitude of citizens. Its location is said to be so fortunate in terms of position and natural attributes that roads converge in it from 4 directions, from which it may be said to be advantageous and suitable as a resting point. That is the Latin word for which would be a mansio, for all where we get our word mansion from all those on public business. An abundance of waters flows there. There are baths in both public and private, a forum decorated with statues of leading citizens of old, a population of inhabitants so numerous that the seating which is in the same place is easily filled. Moreover, due to the downward rush of excess water, there is an abundant number of water mills. Although it is stated that the aforementioned place abounds in all these things, it came about that we have that have declared, as they have declared, must be, that the Nicolaean, that nearby town, demanded before the present time that they be annexed to them. It is unworthy of our times that so unfortunate a location should lose the title of city, and it serves no good purpose for those dwelling there that they should lose all their benefits and advantages through being plundered by a more powerful people. Added to all these considerations, the crowning detail, as it were, is the fact that all the inhabitants of the same place are said to be followers of the most holy religion, sectatore sanctissimae religionis. And there is the point, right? There is the point that these people clearly know that by telling Constantine that they are Christians, that they will get imperial favor, and they do. And this is an incentive for a number of cities to convert. Over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, we have a number of these kind of cases of whole municipalities embracing Christianity, or at least openly professing that through their bishop that the majority are Christians, or that they're all Christians, and then getting a favorable ruling from the emperor. We even get cases, the most famous case of which is from Roman Mesopotamia, the city of Edessa, which is Urfa in modern-day Turkey, where the town becomes Christian and gets favors, and its rival city, Karray Haran, stays pagan. Actually, they're still even pagan when the Arabs arrive in the 7th and 8th centuries. And what happens is, by the power of Roman law, Constantine can promote, augment the various attractions of embracing the new faith, and this comes in various ways. So this is from yes, here. So here is Edessa, the town I was just talking about. This is the city that becomes Christian, and the nearby town of Haran still remains pagan. And we might ask, what was the precise role of the emperor within this new imperial church? There are a lot of debates about this, but you have to again remember Constantine was a Roman. He was a Roman emperor. And I always like to think of Constantine as essentially kind of like the second founder of the Roman world. That is, he plays the role of the Christian emperor who essentially founds the Christian Roman Empire the way that the Emperor Augustus had created the original Roman Empire, the pagan Roman Empire. And just like Augustus, Constantine understood a very important principle in government, which was expressed by the imperial biographer Suetonius when talking about Augustus, but applies just as well to Constantine. Festina lente, make haste slowly. This is the interpretation that Kenneth Harl, in one of his articles entitled Festina Lente, actually basically makes explicit. Constantine essentially had superior auctoritas. He had the influence, the authority, the charisma, the patronage that meant that he had a special position vis-a-vis the bishops. That authority did not mean that he was the boss, that he was somehow superior in spiritual matters to the bishops, but rather that when it came to these kind of issues of governance, these issues of law and so on, his auctoritas meant that his wishes would be seen through to effect. And this authority would be inherited by his sons and by Christian emperors well into the 5th century. So I think it would be anachronistic to think that the bishops were in any way going to challenge the emperor or represent some sort of alternate power in terms of political matters. Far from it. The bishops wanted the emperor's input and innovation. That is, from the very start of Constantine's career as a Christian emperor, and I do believe that he did convert in 312, as he said. I think the evidence points to that absolutely. And I think that as he accepted Christ as God, I think that definitely within very short time after that, and his kind of working with the bishops, he very much saw it as a kind of symphony of his own imperial power, backing up the bishops in their capacities, helping to spread Christianity throughout the Roman world in whatever means he could. And if that meant granting special favors to municipalities that converted en masse, then he would do that. If it meant building churches, he would definitely do that. In specific regard to North Africa, there was a split in the church there, a schism. It had come about as a result of the tetrarchic persecutions from 303 down, until they were halted in the West by Constantine in 312. The African church was very important. I mentioned before that it was the first truly significant Latin-speaking communities. It boasted of brilliant bishops of Carthage. One thinks of Saint Cyprian, one of the earliest writers in Christian Latin, Tertullian the Apologist, and all those other writers, Lactantius, Arnobius, Minucius Felix, and of course, in time, the great father of the church, Saint Augustine. And this church, the North African Latin-speaking church, had really been split, though, unfortunately, over the issue of the persecutions, because many Christians had lapsed and had offered sacrifices during the persecutions. In Latin, they were known as the lapsi, the lapsed. And then they came back to the church, and they wanted to be kind of integrated into the Christian community. Now, there were plenty of others, the majority of others, indeed, who were Christians who refused to buckle under, who went into the arena, and in many instances were arrested and would have been executed. Or some of them, those would have been the martyrs. The ones who were tortured but then released are known as confessors in the church. So they confessed their faith and suffered physically for it, sometimes losing limbs, losing eyes, and being whipped and beaten, all sorts of terrible physical tortures. The Romans specialized in these kind of horrendous tortures, and they were still alive, and their family members were still alive, and these were very, very fresh wounds, literally. And now all of a sudden you have all of these people who lapsed and came back as if, just okay, so back to normal again. I'm going to be a Christian again after having sacrificed to the gods. Well, they really resented that, and they really felt that these people had not just sold out. Selling out maybe it was too weak of a term, but they had denied Christ. They had just like Saint Peter had, in the Gospels, when Saint Peter was asked if he knew Christ on the eve of Good Friday, and 3 times he denied him. And it is no accident that after that, after the resurrection, the Gospels report that after the resurrection, the angel tells the women, "Go tell the apostles and Peter that the Lord is risen." In other words, Peter was in some sense no longer an apostle because of his threefold denial of Christ. And if you are familiar with the Gospels, you will know that after the resurrection, when St. Peter meets the risen Christ again, the Lord will ask him 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" Each time Peter saying yes, sort of atoning for, making up for his denial, his threefold denial. And only then he becomes kind of integrated back into the community of the faithful. Well, it's a big deal to deny Christ. Okay, it's a big deal. The Lord says, anyone who denies me before men, I will deny before my Father in heaven. And he who confesses me before men, I will confess before my Father in heaven. So you have all of that going on in North Africa. And then, of course, there is the miracle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. Constantine converts to Christianity and issues the Edict of Milan. There is a reprieve. The church is no longer not just persecuted, but it is given imperial favor. All of those people who were released from dungeons and prisons came to be, and who were able now to be back into the, practicing Christianity openly. Many of them do not want to associate with any of the people who had denied Christ during the persecutions. And those people who were lapsed included some bishops and priests and deacons and other clergy. They did not want to be associated with those people anymore. And so those who were kind of the hardliners associated themselves or came to kind of organize their churches around a certain bishop known as Donatus. Okay. And from that man's name, they take the name of their movement known as the Donatists. Okay. The followers of Donatus. And their argument was that if a person had sacrificed during the persecution, if a person had lapsed, that person were no longer a Christian. Okay. And if you wanted it to be reintegrated into the community, you had to be rebaptized. Okay, this is a very rigorous argument. Okay, the other side, however, and also I should say that if a clergyman had lapsed, then the sacraments that were performed by that clergyman were no longer valid. That his baptisms were not really baptisms, his Eucharists were not really Eucharists, his marriages were not really marriages, and so on. Again, a very rigorous argument. The other side, though, which followed a man named Caecilian, and you won't be surprised to hear that they are called Caecilianists, basically argued, no, look at the example of St. Peter in the gospel accounts. The church is made up of sinful people, and we do have confession, the sacrament of confession, where all sins can be forgiven. And moreover, after a period of penance, of course, a person can go back to receiving the Eucharist, and they have not lost irrevocably the grace of the Holy Spirit. And the priests, the sacraments of the priests or the bishops who have lapsed, that sin that they have committed in no way affects the validity of the sacraments that minister, that priest or bishop performs. There's no, that you could have the personal moral life of a clergyman does not impact the validity of the sacraments. If you wanted to have a kind of analogy of this in our own secular age, you might say something like, you could have a doctor, let's say a cardiologist, who smokes and eats donuts every day or whatever, and doesn't care at all about exercise, but he is totally capable of performing open heart surgeries and helping people, and saving people's lives in that regard. In the same way, even the dirtiest priest, even the most sinful person, if he is canonically ordained, his sacraments are still the immaculate body and blood of Christ. So there's a split, therefore there's a schism between the Donatist side and the Caecilianist side. What happened was that representatives of both sides presented letters and petitions to the Emperor Constantine, and in 315 Constantine ruled in favor of the Caecilianists. That is the broader position that a person would go to confession and confess their sins. There would be a period of penance, no doubt, where a person would not receive the Eucharist. They would fast and pray and perform, deeds of charity and so on. But then that person ultimately would be able to be reintegrated into the full body of the faithful. The Donatists said no. They did not want to accept this, and so there was a total schism there. The split in the African Church kind of solidified, or that's not even the right word, it kind of hardened, I guess. And the Donatists refused to accept the emperor's ruling. They maintained their own churches. really down until the 5th century, when a group of barbarians known as the Vandals showed up and wiped out almost everybody in North Africa, and the Donatists with them. Um, so that's the only way that that schism ever was totally wiped out. I will just say that that same schismatic sort of mentality, or that same kind of the same sort of problem, in a sense, I should say, uh, still crops up in the history of the church right on up until the 21st century. I myself am, as I've mentioned before, a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, and during the course of the 20th century, the Russian church was split. There was the church in Russia, and then the church that had fled after the Communist Revolution in 1917, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, or ROKOR as it's often called. And many of the people who were part of the ROKOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, had family members who were martyrs. Sometimes even people were named after their recent relatives who had been martyred by the godless Bolsheviks. And just terrible millions and millions of people executed, and in the most horrendous fashion, sent to gulags, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. And there was this split between the church that had stayed in Russia and those who had stayed abroad, who had gone abroad. And particularly this schism was very, very painful, because during the World War II, what Stalin basically did was he went to those gulags and took out a number of bishops and reinstated and basically reformed the Moscow Patriarchate, so that because he wanted to co-opt the church and make it subservient to the godless regime. And so he could, have bishops and priests preaching communism, basically, or, statist messages from the pulpit. And he could have people, the priests listening to the confessions of individuals, asking them, does your mother say bad things about Stalin back home? Does your father ever speak against the party? And so on. And then those people would all of a sudden disappear. So it was a very, very terrible situation. And then communism fell completely, without any war, without any act of man, really. You could say Reagan helped out in the process, but really it was totally a miracle. Communism fell in the early 90s, and there were still many, many people who did not want the churches to rejoin, because they said, how on earth can we go and enter into communion with these filthy communists, basically, these clergymen who were all Communist Party members. And then in 2007, the churches reunited, and there was a schism there too, and it still persists in some ways, of people who do not want to accept the reunification of the two parts of the Russian church. So it's a very vexed issue, but in some ways, it is kind of a replaying of this old Donatist versus Kykilianist dilemma, and we might even call it neo-Donatism or something like that. Anyway, the Donatists would ultimately be wiped out, as I say, in the 5th century by the Vandals. But nonetheless, what is important here is that Constantine is exercising his legal powers as emperor in order for Christian institutions and Christian discipline to prevail. And he was probably even to the point of almost not defining dogma, but sort of codifying the church's position on things and backing it up, of course. See, this is the crucial point. No doubt he was under the council of bishops, and the church's position is what I said, that the moral life of the clergyman does not impact the validity of the sacraments. And this is a question that it really gets to the heart of the whole ecclesiastical ecclesiology and the theology of sacraments and salvation. That was a vast expansion of the earlier precedents of the very few Roman emperors who had ever ruled on legal issues about Christian property before. Remember, I mentioned, Aurelian, vindicated the rights of a certain Christian community over against their bishop, who had kind of turned the property into his own. There were very, very minor incidents before. And therefore, there's a good question. There's a good reason, I should say, why bishops and authors like Eusebius hailed Constantine as the equal to the apostles, the iso apostolikos, which is the title that St. Constantine still has in the Orthodox Church, and why Eusebius would compare him to, say, King David, or compare him to Moses, the Roman equivalent of Moses, the great lawgiver. a man who could win over the bishops and create a unity within the leadership of the Christian church. And some historians have gone so far as to argue that Constantine was an emperor who understood the politics of consensus, of concordia, or homonoia in Greek. Constantine was definitely an autocratic emperor with a vast army behind him, but yet he does still understand this idea of trying to work out negotiations and find peace and a kind of concord among various different parties. In any event, these changes are very important. Constantine had the power to back up his rulings with regard to the Christian church because of two reasons. Of course, he had the imperial army behind him and the imperial bureaucracy behind him. And if we can take a step back for a moment and look at the other rival empire of Rome, that is the Sassanid Empire of Persia and Central Asia, the Sassanid Shahs were Zoroastrians, a monotheistic creed. And it was one that depended very heavily on Iranian institutions. The Shah of Persia really couldn't change his religion. He couldn't just become, say, a Manichaean, although several of them toyed with the idea, it seems. And if they had become Christians, they would have lost the power of the Iranian traditional elites. The traditional elites, who were the Magi, who performed all the religious rites, the kind of clergy of the Zoroastrian faith. These were all so deeply embedded into Iranian or Persian culture. In a way, it would have, if all of a sudden a Persian Shah decided to become Christian, that would have all upended everything. Their whole sense of legitimacy was entirely predicated on the fact that they were, the god, the Ahura Mazda appointed, that was the chief deity of Zoroastrianism, that they had appointed this ruler over the Persian people. What happens in Rome is that you've got almost the same kind of situation, but through really this amazing miracle, Constantine is able to kind of bit by bit change those kind of institutions, begin to reform them, both kind of slowly, but at the same time, though, very deliberately and progressively, to the point where his own bureaucracy and army, even though they are still totally immersed in paganism, he can convert to Christianity and still be their leader. He can still kind of hold this awesome magistracy over them that, of course, the Roman emperor always had. And so when he decided to ultimately convert to Christianity, he had both the means to enforce it, even though his own people, the armies and the bureaucracy, oftentimes was not 100%, by any means, not 100% Christian. And that this is so significant. This is so huge of an event. This is what, I guess, the major point of what I'm trying to say is that only in the West, really, do you have this complete conversion to Christianity, where ultimately Christianity becomes the faith of Europe. And nowhere else really in the world. In some other pockets we will see, in some places like Ethiopia, you will get this. But for the most part, though, it really is only in the West where you have this complete saturation of Christianity and the political apparatus. And this is furthermore significant because we're going to see in our next lecture the pagan emperor that follows Constantine in a few years after his death, Julian, someone who only rules for a brief period of time, from 360 to 363. He was a very odd pagan ruler. He was reared as a Christian and then became an apostate. He went over to paganism. And what Julian did, in the words of the scholar Peter Brown, who you see in front of you, was that he tried to out Constantine by essentially taking the Christian imperial-backed church of Constantine and trying to kind of mimic its order and its administration, and to counteract all the activities of Constantine and Constantine's sons by transferring all of that organization and charity and good works and everything over to paganism, which of course never had this kind of tradition of organization, nor of charities and good works and all the rest of it. And what Constantine organized was an imperial church in which emperor and bishops together cooperated and attempted to carry out the greater mission of converting the Roman world and winning the favor of God. And that's really the best way of understanding the relationship between emperor and bishops, than any kind of notions that there was some kind of conflict or that they were opposing, dynamics. The logical conclusion, therefore, of Constantine's relationship with the bishops and the Christian Church is perhaps in some ways will be mirrored in the caliphate of medieval Islam, where secular and religious power essentially became kind of embodied into one. Not as close as it would be in the Byzantine situation of the Byzantine emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople. What developed also in the medieval world of the Pope and the independent secular rulers, that's actually the farthest thing from what Constantine and the bishops of his day thought the relationship of secular and divine should be. That's a whole other story. Constantine had two very other important acts that really ensured the advancement of Christianity. One was the creation of the city of Constantinople as the new Christian capital, the new Rome. The other one is the Council of Nicaea. We'll deal with that momentarily. Let's talk about the creation of the new Christian capital of the Roman Empire, the new Rome, Constantinople. This was far more effective than any legislation he passed against the pagan cults. And he passed very, very limited legislation against the pagan cults. That's a really important point to make. He did not really outlaw paganism at all. Most of the efforts to ban cults were taken by his sons, actually, and they were seen as very offensive and oftentimes were repealed soon afterwards. Constantine did not try to do that. He didn't try to ban paganism. What in effect he did, though, was he created a new Christian capital that would replace the old Rome of Italy. And there were several reasons for doing this. For one, Rome was no longer a strategic capital. We have seen this throughout the course of our study together, throughout the fighting of the 3rd century and the civil wars of the early 4th century. Rome really was out of the way. Soldier emperors had made their capitals at far more strategic cities. So we're talking about Trier in the north, along the Rhine frontier. We're talking about Milan in Italy, which is far to the north in Italy. We're talking about Nicomedia in the east, Antioch, also further in the east. All of these functioned as imperial capitals. Constantine chose the ancient city of Byzantium, a Greek colony on the European side of the Bosporus, just within that tradition of looking for kind of places that were closer to the frontier. And Byzantium had a very, very important strategic role. It was on this important crossroads, both land routes and sea routes, going from the Black Sea into the Aegean, going from east to west. It is, of course, the kind of major dividing line between Europe and Asia. And in that sense, what Constantine was doing was simply following what a lot of his pagan predecessors had done. Additionally, though, Constantine also moved the locus of imperial power from the western part of the Roman world to the east as a kind of accumulation of a long process. That is, ever since the middle of the 2nd century AD, increasingly, the senatorial aristocracy, the ruling elites of Rome, had come from the eastern cities, particularly from the cities of Asia Minor and from Syria. And those elites had come evermore to define the role of the Roman emperor. I like to see Constantine, in effect, as the Eastern senatorial elites brought the emperor home, close to where their cities were. But even taking into account these two historical factors that were influencing Constantine's decision, it was still a very momentous and dramatic change. The reason, of course, is that Constantinople, the city of Constantine, New Rome, as it came to be called, was from the start a Christian city. When it was dedicated in 330 AD, pagan Byzantium had essentially disappeared, swallowed up into the imperial Christian Constantinople. Those of you that have visited the city of Constantinople will have, of course, seen the remarkable churches, particularly the one you see in front of you, Hagia Sophia. What we're looking at here is the 3rd version of that church. The first goes back to the 4th century, but it burned during the rioting of the deposition of St. John Chrysostom in 404. There are elements of that church, of that earlier church, still to be seen in the garden of Hagia Sophia to this day, particularly the pulpit. But from the start, all of the pagan temples were in Constantinople were dismantled. The columns were used for building Christian churches. Many of these columns just got recycled into the cisterns, particularly if you see the cistern of Justinian to this day. Of course, the structure that you see in front of you was ultimately built by Justinian in the 6th century. In any event, what happened in Byzantium, a city of maybe 35,000, was replaced by a Christian capital, the Christian capital, that in less than a century grew from 35,000 to 10 times that, 350,000. There was a new downtown. There was the Hippodrome, that is the vast stadium where games, chariot races could be staged for the population of Constantinople. An imperial palace, which essentially occupies the grounds today of what's called the Blue Mosque, the Sultan Ahmed Kami built in the 17th century. Then across the way was Hagia Sophia, and then Saint Irene, Hagia Irini. And this was all to be the place of New Rome. Notice what you don't see here. You don't see a Colosseum, okay? The gladiator events, men killing one another for the delight of the mob, men killing beasts or being killed by beasts, condemned criminals being thrown to the wild beasts, damnatio ad bestias, all of this was totally out of tenor with Christianity. And so while St. Constantine does not outlaw such events, those that would happen in time in the 5th century, nevertheless, he just kind of empties it out. He doesn't build it, okay? So this is basically the general tendency of all of his reforms. Is it's kind of like, something that I at least intellectually know about when you're trying to lose weight, and the doctors always tell you, don't just try to, don't just cut out all of the bad food that you like to eat. Just start by increasing all the good food. Okay. So instead of just saying, I'm never going to eat Twinkies and Coke again, just say, okay, I'm going to have a salad and then I can eat my Twinkies and Coke. It's kind of like that here with paganism and Christianity. So Constantine is not saying, okay, he's not outlawing gladiators, not outlawing, other things. And modern secular scholars have tried to say, you see, he was really just a crypto pagan and he didn't really care about any of that stuff. No, he's obviously slowly beginning this massive transformation of an entire society that had certain things in it. If you have a bad habit, and I'm sure all of us can relate to this on some level. If you have a bad habit that you've been doing for years or even decades, it's very, very hard to just quit overnight. Okay, you have to kind of begin slowly, and that's basically what we're seeing here. So, in his new Christian capital, there was no more blood sport for the entertainment of the mob. In any event, there was also an imperial senate comprised of officials and officers of the imperial government who were now elevated to senators, and of course they would be given villas and pensions and were expected to be Christians. In addition, Rome had 7 hills, so Constantinople had 7 hills. They actually had to fake one of them, but they finally did get 7 hills. The city of Rome, interestingly enough, has more than 7 hills. They just don't count the Janiculum as in the grand number of 7. There's many cities around the world that try to boast to be on 7 hills by doing the same kind of thing. The urban population that had been kind of such a big part of Roman politics going back to the Republic. Constantinople had its own urban population, which, as I say, was entertained by chariot races in the Hippodrome just opposite the imperial palace. But Constantinople, the main point of everything I'm trying to say, it was meant to kind of replace the old Rome. It was the new Rome. The senators in Rome were delighted because the senators in Rome of the old distinguished aristocratic families, now they kind of got a lot of the Christian population sort of siphoned off. They just sort of ignored the Christian capital and ran Rome well into the 5th century as a pagan city. We're going to be looking at some of those people in upcoming lectures. The political and religious center of the Roman Empire had now come to rest, to abide, to settle in Constantinople as a decidedly Christian city. Furthermore, Constantinople, with its churches, and we'll be discussing this in greater detail today, was the model for building churches in provincial cities, particularly the Hagia Sophia. And we will see this particularly in the 6th century, but even in Constantine's day and the reign of his sons, especially Constantius II, who ruled from 337 to 361. The churches in Constantinople were taken as models for building cathedral churches in provincial cities. If you go to Ephesus, outside of the city, you can see the Church of the Virgin Mary, the Church of the Theotokos, the Mother of God. which is still being reconstructed to this in our day. It is a vast double church of the early 5th century, which was actually built in part in using the old temple of Zeus of Olympus, and in many ways is a basilican church modeled after what we think the churches in Constantinople looked like in the early 4th century. That is the original Hagia Sophia that was destroyed. Visiting Ephesus today and seeing this church, or at least what you can see the foundations of it, it was a very impressive church with a huge nave and apse, with a courtyard that is paved with all sorts of classical spolia. This is the Latin word for recycled bits of stone, oftentimes with inscriptions that are very interesting to scholars, reused from the 2nd and 3rd centuries and built into the walls. It has a baptistry. And we feel that scholars feel that the church really approximates pretty well what churches would have looked like in Constantinople in Constantine's day. The reconstruction and restoration of that church is therefore a very important element in understanding the Christianization of the Roman East. Constantinople played this major role as acting as sort of a beacon for Christians in the Roman East and as providing a model of how to build churches and Christianize one's own city. The importance of Constantinople, therefore, cannot be overstated. By the end of the 4th century or the beginning of the 5th century, it had probably surpassed all cities in the Roman world, except for Old Rome and Alexandria in terms of population. Old Rome had about 1 million people in it, so that was definitely the largest city in the entire Mediterranean world. But within a century, by the year 400, it even had eclipsed Rome and Alexandria. It had grown to a city that some would think at this time, perhaps even by the time of Justinian in the 6th century, may well have been as much as 1 million. Certainly it was 750,000, but it may very well have been about a population of 1 million, and the population of Old Rome would have decreased by that time. So therefore, Constantinople became the queen of cities, the dominant Christian center in the Roman Eastern Empire. Building the capital at Constantinople, creating a Christian capital, was a significant statement by the Emperor Constantine. And as I said, he couldn't outlaw the cults. He didn't want to. There was so much, a part of it wouldn't have been part of things that wouldn't have been a wise move, really. It would have kind of caused social upheaval. So what he did was he built a Christian capital and therefore inspired cities to follow that example. And many popular works say that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, but he did not. That is a mistake, and it really is. It's not just a mistake in fact, but it totally misunderstands the whole Constantinian principle of sort of adding and letting paganism sort of slip out on its own, die out on its own. And ultimately, it would only be in 391 or 392 under the Emperor Theodosius that Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire. But the building of Constantinople definitely was a significant step in that direction. That is indeed one of the questions for your final exam. What are the major kind of steps in the process of making Christianity the dominant religion in the West? Certainly, all of these things of Constantine are a major one. The other crucial step in the direction of the Christianization of the Roman world under Constantine was the Council of Nicaea, the so-called First Ecumenical Council that was held in 325. Council of Nicaea can be studied in various ways, and the most important of them, of course, is the theological way, and that is what I'd like to talk about right now. In particular, the Council of Nicaea was to deal with an issue known as Arianism. This has nothing to do with Nazism. It's not that kind of Arian. It's Arian, A-R-I-A-N. Contemporaries described Arius as a sophisticated, austere, serious, even grim man. And the description fit with his past. He had been a part of a rigorous Egyptian sect that refused to associate with sinners or any Christians associated with them. The Bishop of Alexandria had bent over backwards to heal that schism. Perhaps the kind old bishop was a bit too gracious. He had not only accepted the somber cleric back into communion, but even gave him care of one of the most prestigious churches in the bustling port city of Alexandria. And there, beginning in 313 AD, Arius built quite a following for himself. It was said that over 700 consecrated virgins and many wealthy widows lived in a community that he oversaw and hung on his every word. To many others, however, his words were very disturbing. He was a priest, and he would preach in Alexandria. God is one, he said, and of course, so far, so good. But then he went on to argue that if God were one and unique, then Jesus cannot also be God. Certainly, Jesus is the incarnation of the Logos, that is plainly taught in Scripture, John 1, 1-4. However, the Word, the Logos, is distinct from God, the Father. He is the only begotten one, the firstborn. And that meant that he is the only one that God created directly. In other words, God made the Logos first out of nothing so that he could make use of him to make everything else. This was necessary, Arius taught, because the finite creatures whom God intended to create could not possibly endure the awesome power they would encounter should God the Father create them directly. Almighty God then needed an instrument, as it were, an intermediary. So God created the Logos, the first of the creatures, and the Logos was to be the brush in the hand of the divine artist. Of course, Arius taught, since the Logos, God the Son, was created out of nothing like everything else, then obviously there was a time when he was not. The Son is wonderful, most assuredly, but if a line were to be drawn separating the infinite, uncreated God from finite, created nature, God the Father alone would be on the divine, supernatural side of the line, and the Logos would be on the other side with the rest of us and the created universe. An additional corollary to this teaching was also alarming. God the Father is so utterly transcendent that the Logos really cannot know him as he truly is. Therefore, he cannot fully reveal the Father to us, but perhaps that is just as well, for even if the Logos himself cannot know God, neither can we. Moreover, the Logos, being a creature, can change. And that means he could possibly have sinned as Lucifer had sinned. But God, foreseeing his merits, granted him the grace needed to protect him from falling. So yes, he is called the Son, but only by virtue of adoption, thanks to the grace of God, which he needs as much as we do. For Arius and his disciples, this adopted Son is utterly unlike and inferior to God the Father. Okay, so that is the heresy of Arianism in a nutshell. Now, he went further. Jesus, the Son of God the Father, is himself called God at least 3 times directly in the New Testament and 16 times in the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, and of course in Second Clement, and in all sorts of other apostolic fathers. And from earliest days, obviously, it had been part of the entire bedrock foundation of Christianity. To understand that Jesus is God incarnate and to worship him as such. The oldest surviving account of a Christian martyrdom, that of Polycarp, which we looked at briefly, clearly testifies to this. I'll read you a quote from it now. It will be impossible for us to forsake Christ or to worship any other. For him, being the Son of God, we adore, adoramus, and but the martyrs we cherish. Okay, notice this difference between adoring or worshiping Christ as God and cherishing or venerating the martyrs. End quote. That is to be found in the Martyrdom of Polycarp, chapter 27, verses 2-3. Yet it was also traditional from the time of Moses and the prophets to proclaim that the Lord our God is Lord alone, right? The famous Shema of Deuteronomy, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Frankly, Arius taught, there is more than a little tension between these two seemingly contradictory affirmations. How can we both worship the Father and his Son as God and still maintain that there is only one God? This, of course, has been a problem. It is one of the major kind of problems that can be found in among thinkers stretching back all the way, of course, to Islam and right on up to Unitarianism in America today. No text of the New Testament neatly reconciles these two truths intellectually, it must be said. For the most part, Christians of the first 2 centuries did not try to offer any concrete explanation They were content, it seems, to profess this sort of double truth, to live it and reverently bow before it. And of course, when looked at from another way, the incomprehensibility, in a sense, of the doctrine of the Trinity is, in some sense, not an argument against its truth, but rather for it. For if it were simply a human creation, the church would not be so adamant about the necessity of the doctrine of the Trinity. It challenges the mind in a way that, say, strict envisioning God as a strict monad would not. Well, as far as Arius were concerned, such a pious approach simply evaded the hard-nosed thinking required to explain this conundrum. He was not the first to offer a rational attempt at explanation. Several had tried in the 3rd century. In Rome, for instance, there was the group of heretics known as the modalists, who oftentimes are referred to as Sabellians because of a certain priest in Rome named Sabellius who championed this opinion. They began from the vantage point of God's essential unity, and their solution was to say that God the Father broke into our history as Jesus, and then after ascending back to heaven, returned once more as the Holy Spirit. So God is forever one, and the Trinity simply consists of 3 successive modes or roles played by the same supreme God over the course of salvation history. So at one point, the same God is acting in the mode of the Father, at other points acting in the mode of the Son, and at other points acting in the mode of the Holy Spirit. Modalism, therefore, reduces the Trinity to a kind of divine show. Arius, though, starting from the typical Eastern vantage point of 3 distinct entities, resolved the problem in the reverse. God is one because the Father alone is true God, and the Son and the Holy Spirit are, as well, like angels and human beings, creatures. But actually, Arius and the modalists are really not opposites. Their views are 2 examples of the very same kind of one-sided choice. And needless to say or to repeat, choice is the meaning of the Greek word hairesis, which gives us our word heresy. If he is truly infinite and transcendent, the truth about God cannot be fully grasped by the finite mind. As St. Augustine would say a century later, what you understand cannot possibly be God. He says this in Sermon 117, chapter 3, verse 5. God cannot be solved as if he were a math problem or mastered once and for all like a crossword puzzle. The work, and even more so the very nature of God, cannot appear to the human mind as anything short of mystery. This mystery typically presents itself to us as a series of paradoxes. God is one, yet God is 3. Jesus is human, yet Jesus is divine. These paradoxes are truths in tension. They strain the brain, and they summon the human mind to bow in awe and worship. And that's what I was trying to say before, that in their own way, they are proofs of their paradoxical nature, and the fact that the church holds so adamantly to them challenges us. If the church just wanted to kind of get us on board easily, it wouldn't continually challenge us with these very, very paradoxical and difficult to understand mysteries. Heresy arises when thinkers, annoyed by this tension, seek to relax it by eliminating one of the seemingly contradictory truths. Impatient with mystery, heresy seeks to domesticate it. Making a choice of one or the other side of the paradox, heresy attempts to rationalize what is beyond human reason. The modalists preserve the divinity of the Son at the expense of his individuality. The Son is no more than a role to be played, a temporary mask worn by God. Arius, on the other hand, turned the distinction between the Father and the Son into a rigid separation and preserved the unity of God by sacrificing the diversity of the Son. For Arius, the Father and the Son are 2 entirely different beings. The Father is God and the Son is not. His explanation appealed to many because it seemed clear, simple, and logical. If he is the Son, he was begotten. And if he is begotten, he had a beginning. And if he had a beginning, he is not infinite. And if he is not infinite, he is not God. The choice to reduce the mystery of God to such neat little syllogisms is one of the hallmarks of heresy. Okay. Now, the arrogance of heresy is clearly shown by this. And indeed, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria sensed that Arius's teaching did violence to the church's rule of faith. He assumed this must be a sincere but misguided error on the part of the venerable old priest. And surely, thought the bishop, if we call him aside and point out his error, he will see it and mend his ways. But Arius ignored his bishop and fellow Alexandrian clergy, except for the few who agreed with him. And in 320, Alexander called a meeting of the bishops of Egypt and the surrounding areas, trying to deal with this issue. Out of the approximately 100 who gathered, 80 of them agreed to excommunicate Arius if he did not retract his erroneous teaching, which of course he refused to do. This illustrates another classic hallmark of heresy. It obstinately clings to a private opinion despite correction from the church and its established authority. The heretic considers himself wiser than his colleagues, wiser than his superiors, more orthodox, more Catholic than the church. Forced to choose between the church's teaching and his own, he prefers his own, and thus heresy is characterized by a double arrogance. Since it refuses to bow before the mystery, it naturally refuses to bow before the church. And the pride of Arius becomes even more apparent when it is contrasted with the attitude of Origen, the great Alexandrian theologian whom we looked at earlier, who lived and taught a century before the time of Arius. Listen to what he says. I want to be a man of the church. I do not want to be called the name of some founder of a heresy, but by the name of Christ, and to bear that name which is blessed on earth. It is my desire, indeed, as in spirit, to be called a Christian. If I, who seem to be your right hand and am called presbyter and seem to preach the word of God, if I do something against the discipline of the church, then may the whole church in unanimous resolve cut me its right hand off and throw me away. Rather than assume the posture of Origen and humbly submit, Arius fled Egypt and took refuge with an old school chum, one Eusebius, not the famous Eusebius that I've been talking about this whole course, but a different bishop, Eusebius, bishop of Nicomedia. And evidently, these theological bedfellows had picked up the teaching of the son's inferiority from their teacher, a man named Lucian of Antioch, who had been martyred in 312 during the great persecutions. They began drumming up support from other bishops in various cities, most of whom were former students of Lucian as well, and so formed a tight-knit cadre of influential leaders. In addition to this political maneuvering, Arius took his ideas directly to the masses by expressing them in poetic lyrics set to catchy tunes. Alexandrian sailors stopping in the port of Nicomedia learned these theological sea shanties and proceeded to carry them back to Alexandria and indeed to ports all over the Mediterranean. Well, in this volatile situation faced by Constantine when he arrived to occupy the imperial palace in Nicomedia, he immediately deputized his ecclesiastical advisor, Hosius of Cordoba, whom we met yesterday. He asked him to investigate this controversy and to summon an assembly of bishops so as to resolve the matter in the nearby city of Nicaea. Gatherings of bishops called synods or councils had met, well, of course, since the 40s AD, and the first of which is mentioned in the book of Acts, the Council of Jerusalem, but throughout the church's history, from the 2nd century onwards, to address disciplinary and doctrinal issues. They were usually large local assemblies of bishops, but they had never presumed to speak definitely for the entire church. Never before had a council been convened by a Christian emperor, and never since the Council of the Apostles in Jerusalem, as I mentioned, Acts 15, had a council been faced with an issue so vital to the very heart of the Christian faith. Soon after it took place, therefore, this council that was summoned in 325 AD came to be described as ecumenical or universal in scope. This term ecumenical has nothing to do with the modern heresy of ecumenism, which is really just religious syncretism, the idea that all paths lead to the same God or some kind of nonsense like that. Rather, this word ecumenical means universal. It speaks for the whole Catholic Church, the whole universal church. In distinction from the regional synods that were part of everyday life, this ecumenical council would pertain to the church universal. From an ecclesiastical point of view, an ecumenical council can be understood as a representative of bishops gathering from the entire household of the faith. In fact, the word oikos, which is at the heart of the word ecumenical, means household. Okay, the church universal, which addresses matters vital to all members of the faithful and therefore makes decisions that are binding upon all. Okay, without accepting the decisions of the first 7 ecumenical councils, a person cannot be considered to be a member of the Orthodox Church. Neither the term nor the eventual definition of ecumenical council had been worked out, however, by the time that the council met in AD 325. Nonetheless, all who attended this solemn gathering were clearly aware that they were involved in an unprecedented and historic event. Naturally, Arius, Eusebius, the bad Eusebius, and their supporters were all there. And so were the bishops of Alexandria, who had excommunicated Arius, and the bishops of Antioch and Jerusalem, who supported him. The emperor himself, Constantine, was there accompanied by his advisor, Bishop Hosius, who was very old at this time, probably in his 90s. Several of the bishops who came had endured imprisonment and torture 15 years earlier during the great persecutions. For instance, the Bishop Paul of Neo-Caesarea had lost the use of his hands because of the torture that he had endured during those persecutions. Paphnutius of Egypt had one eye put out and one leg hamstrung. He was personally embraced and kissed by Constantine after the old warrior of Christ hobbled into the council. Prior synods had customarily followed Roman senatorial procedures. Traditionally, the emperor attended the deliberations of the Roman Senate but did not vote. And so it was at Nicaea, Roman procedure also dictated that the senior senator always speak first. This would be the princeps senatus, and he voted first and signed any decrees first. Now, the bishop in attendance who in some ways filled this role was certainly the name that is most familiar to most people, was another confessor for the faith during the persecution, and is none other than Bishop Nicholas of Myra in the area of Lycia in southern Asia Minor. He is, because of the Dutch tradition of celebrating Saint Nicholas, whose feast day is December 6th, to celebrate him around the time of Christmas. Saint Nicholas, or as in Dutch, he's called Santa Claus, is of course associated with Christmas, but he was a real historical person, and he is a great saint of the church. His relics, he originally was buried in Lycia in southern Asia Minor, but then his relics were moved during the Middle Ages to after the Turks gained control of that area. His relics were moved to the city of Bari in Italy, where there is actually a Russian Orthodox church right next to his relics. It's in the basement of a Catholic church, but I was there personally as a place of pilgrimage, and my son, my eldest son, is named Nicholas in his honor. I myself was actually baptized on the feast day of Saint Nicholas. So a great saint of the church. He was present at the Council of Nicaea. No one knows exactly how many bishops attended the council. One participant, the tradition, the number that has come down has been fixed at the number 318, since this was the number of the armed servants of Abraham who came to rescue Abraham's kin, which we read about in the book of Genesis 14:14. It would be wonderful to have a copy of the official minutes, the acta of the council, complete with a list of all the participants and the text of all their speeches, but if such written records ever existed, they have been lost. What we do know, however, is that at Nicaea, the bishops did something that had never been done by church councils prior to AD 325. They expressed their teaching by drafting a creed that all were bound to accept and promote as a universal standard of the authentic Christian faith. Prior to this, there had been creeds used almost exclusively for the instruction and baptism of new converts. Their exact wording varied somewhat from city to city. The bishops or fathers of the Council of Nicaea, as they came to be called, evidently took a local baptismal creed and carefully edited it so that the precise wording clearly defined the divinity of Christ and ruled out the teachings of Arius. Very significantly, I think the word logos does not appear in the Nicene Creed, I think precisely because of this problem of Arianism, and maybe even some problems that had already begun to emerge from the writings of Origen a century earlier. So wanting to avoid any kind of confusion, that word is left out, though, of the creed. After starting positively about what the church believes, the creedal statement then goes on to condemn Arian opinions that were incompatible with the true Christian faith. Those who continued stubbornly to hold to such opinions were automatically excommunicated, or, in the words of St. Paul, anathematized. That is referring to Galatians 1:8, where St. Paul says, if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you another gospel, contrary to that which we preach to you, let him be anathema. And this is what the creed says. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is, from the essence ousia of the Father. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one essence, homoousios, with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven and became incarnate, and was made man, suffered and arose on the third day, according to the scriptures, and ascended into the heavens, and sitteth at the right hand of the Father, and shall come again with glory to judge both the living and the dead. Now, at this point, I know you're probably thinking there's much more to it. It just there would be an addendum placed to the end of it in the next ecumenical council, that is the Council of Constantinople in 381, where it more fully articulates the church's belief in the Holy Spirit. But at this point, the Creed of Nicaea just says, and in the Holy Spirit, we believe in the Holy Spirit, and then stops. And then there are these kind of condemnations of the Arian position. And those who say there was a point when the Son of God was not, and before he was begotten, he was not, and that he came into being from things that are not, or that he is of different hypostasis or essence, ousia, or that he is mutable or alterable, the universal and apostolic church anathematizes. Attempts had been made to write this creed using scriptural language alone, but the results were neither clear enough nor strong enough to express the faith of the church in a way that would completely rule out any Arian interpretation. So the decision was made by the fathers to employ two technical terms not found in scripture. Again, remember the basic ecclesiastical position that I put out before, that the Bible is not the supreme authority. Okay, the church is the supreme authority. The church's authority is what decided what works, what texts were to be included in the Bible and which ones were not. And so the church's authority is prior to that of Scripture. So the church's authority is absolutely within its rights to have used terms that are not directly found in the Bible, and to express and to clarify teachings that are, of course, found embedded on the pages of Scripture. The words here in question are the words ousia, that I've put into parentheses for you, being or essence, and then the words homoousios, which is of the same essence. Okay. The point was to make utterly clear that Jesus Christ was not some form of inferior being to God the Father, but rather that the Father and Son are equally divine. For Arius, the terms begotten and created were synonymous, but for the council, they were not. In fact, the person who actually codified the term begotten, genetos, was Origen. Okay, and so the church did use that terminology that Origen had codified a century earlier, that the Son is ai genetos, that is eternally begotten, always begotten. but begotten and created are not the same thing. The Father begets or generates the Son from all eternity. He most assuredly, though, does not create him out of nothing at some moment in time. That is the Church's position. All but a few of the Council Fathers were eager to completely rule out Arianism as an acceptable form of Christianity. So they agreed to use the term homoousios, of the same essence, because it helped them to accomplish this mission. Nevertheless, even many of those who consented to the use of this term homoousios had reservations about it, and these concerns can be reduced to the following four principles. One, even though Origen, the great Alexandrian, had used the term homoousios to help clarify the doctrine of the Trinity, he had apparently borrowed the term from the Gnostic heretics. Another condemned heretic of the 3rd century had also used the term and done so in a completely heterodox sense. So the term was, if you like, tainted by heretical associations. That was one objection that certain fathers of the council put forward to this term. The second was, number two, in Greek, homoousios could mean essentially of the same stuff, as if divinity were a material sort of thing that was divvied up among the Father and the Son. You see, the word ousia in Greek is used in classical Greek. I'm thinking of Plato and other classical authors to mean property or inheritance. Even it's the Greek language is very, very fluid, and words can have different shades of meanings, and it of course can be very precise when it wants to be, but at the same time the words have a history, and these Greek words had been around for so many centuries by this point, that they had shades of meanings that in one meaning it was okay, in another it wasn't. Number three, homoousios could also be used to imply that the Father and the Son were the exact same individual in the modalist sense, the heretical modalist sense. So one of the bishops who championed the use of the term actually did have strong modalist tendencies, and this only confirmed the suspicions of several Orthodox bishops that the use of the term was inadvisable. And the fourth objection that some fathers held was that homoousios was not a biblical term. It was not found in Scripture, and this probably was the most troubling thing to many of the conservative bishops. Ultimately, only 18 of the bishops hesitated to sign the creed. In the end, everyone but Arius and two of his most ardent supporters put their signature to it. And after leaving Nicaea, Constantine wrote to all the churches of the empire, encouraging obedience to the council. He says the following: that which has commended itself to the judgment of 300 bishops cannot be other than the judgment of God, seeing that the Holy Spirit, dwelling in the minds of persons of such character and dignity, has effectually enlightened then respecting the divine will. Wherefore let no one vacillate or linger, but let all with alacrity return to the undoubted path of truth, that when I shall arrive among you, which will be as soon as possible, I may with you return due thanks to God, the inspector of all things, for having revealed the pure faith and having restored to you that love for which we have prayed. Now, Arius and two of his diehard supporters were exiled, but it never even came down to that. Because Arius actually died more or less right afterwards, when the council was dismissed. He died. The traditional account of him is that his guts basically fell out of him when he was in an outhouse, and that he had some kind of rupture in his intestines and died a very miserable death. The tradition about St. Nicholas during the council is that at one point St. Nicholas approached Arius when he was refusing to recant his heretical positions and slapped him in the face. And you can't do that, of course, if you're a bishop, usually. And so the other bishops immediately basically deposed him, saying you can't, as a bishop, you're not worthy of being a bishop. You're going to go around hitting people. But then that night, the bishops who had deposed him had a dream of the Virgin Mary returning St. Nicholas's stole, his omophorion in Greek, his bishop's stole, the kind of vestment signifying his office as bishop, returning it to St. Nicholas, and the understanding being that he was defending her honor as the mother of God and, of course, the honor of her son. And so he was reinstated as bishop. Now, and then also two of the ringleaders of the Arian movement, Eusebius of Nicomedia and another man, were ultimately exiled, but then because they were so politically savvy, they kind of found themselves back into, they sort of wended their way, or, kind of wormed their way back into the body politic in subsequent years. But nevertheless, Constantine and most of the bishops were jubilant, because the Holy Spirit, through the council fathers, had spoken and the case was closed. Now, that is the theological side of the Council of Nicaea. They also determined the reckoning of Easter. I should just mention that too, when it should be performed. And the formula that the church codified for the date of Easter. Remember, there were some people who said that Easter should be celebrated on the 14th of the month of Nisan, no matter what day of the week that is, even if it's a Tuesday, you should celebrate it then. There are others who said, no, absolutely not. You can't celebrate with the Jews. And so, the Old Testament Passover has been superseded by the New Testament Passover. So there was this distinction. There was this dispute. So the church decided on the formula that Pascha would be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Okay, so that and then the Old Testament Pascha, the Jewish Passover, would never coincide with the New Testament Pascha. That was another issue that was also settled. But so those are the two issues determined, really the two primary issues. But that's the theological side. On the other side of things, though, and this is a side that's often overlooked, but it's important for our course together on pagans and Christians, is what was the impact that the council had on onlookers? And here, I think, is something that is really important to think about. First of all, the difference between paganism and Christianity is very much highlighted here. There never was anything like this sort of thing for paganism, okay? Where you have a bunch of pagan priests sitting around hashing out, what do we really believe about the nature of Zeus? No, there is nothing like that whatsoever. In fact, theology, in its true sense of talking about the nature of God, is only really in existence in Christianity. It doesn't ever really exist in anything outside of Christianity, where there is this true direct revelation of God. Yes, of course, there are Jewish scholars who talk about the law and about various interpretations of scripture. In Islam, of course, you get a lot of that sort of thing with hadiths and commentaries on them, and what is permissible in this situation and what is the nature of this and that injunction and so on. But in terms of actually talking about the nature of God and about his relationship, the internal relationship between the persons of the Trinity, that is only really in existence in Christianity. And this is something that is, of course, brought to the fore. No doubt, pagans, I think, would have had a hard time understanding that even in an objective kind of sense. But just from an external point of view, I think it would have had the same impact on the pagan population as, say, the building of the city of Constantinople. Let's think about it. In 325, maybe 12 or 13 years since the ending of the persecutions in the West, but only 1 year, really, after the ending of the persecutions in the East. Remember, Licinius in the East had, the co-emperor in the East had continued reinvigorated persecutions against the Christians, and Constantine therefore had to invade the East and thereby became the supreme emperor, the sole emperor of the whole empire. He, by the way, just to kind of finish that story, you remember Licinius was married to Constantine's half-sister. His half-sister at first interceded on her husband's behalf and begged him, please don't kill him, just send him into exile, kind of put him into house arrest or something like that. And so he had first agreed upon that, but then when it began to look like he really could not be trusted, that he had a son, also Licinius, that could maybe, grow to maybe create a kind of challenge to the new order that Constantine had initiated. Constantine ultimately did have Licinius and his son executed in the year 325. But I'm sorry to go off on so many tangents. Let's think about this for a moment. My point was that I think to pagan onlookers, the Council of Nicaea would have had the same impact essentially as the building of the city of Constantinople. But what I mean by that is simply 12 years before, there had been a cessation of persecutions in the West. Only in the previous year, a cessation of persecutions in the East. And now, all of a sudden, bishops from all over the Roman world, the vast majority of which were from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, but nevertheless, there were still many from the West, even as far afield as Ireland, it seems, with great retinues of people and deacons and administrators and so on, all traveling to the city of Nicaea, came to consult with one another under the auspices of the Roman Emperor Constantine on religious matters. And these included men like Patriarch Alexander of Alexandria, who had been arrested during the Tetrarchic persecutions. Many of these bishops had suffered tortures or arrests, as I've said, under Diocletian, and now they were summoned in the presence of the emperor in order to converse about this new faith. If that wasn't a miracle to pagans, I don't know what was. We actually have a contemporary report written by St. Gregory the theologian, sometimes referred to as St. Gregory Nazianzus, who reports that while Bishop of Caesarea, this is Kayseri in modern-day Turkey, Gregory the theologian says that his father, who was also named Gregory, saw the bishops going to Nicaea for the Great Council, and he was so impressed that that a certain pagan decurion, that his father, as he at that time was not a Christian, was actually a pagan decurion, within 4 years not only had converted to Christianity, would convert to Christianity, but then would be consecrated as a bishop of Caesarea. Okay, so the father of St. Gregory the theologian, witnessing the event of the Council of Nicaea, 4 years later, is not only converts to Christianity, but actually becomes a bishop. They did have some married bishops still at that time, if you're wondering. And I think he represents an example of a number of decurions and imperial officials who, seeing the Council of Nicaea and Constantine's petition, embraced the new faith. So to a pagan, what Constantine did was to invert the role between emperor and the gods, in a sense. Now the emperor summoned the bishops, whereas pagan emperors used to visit the sanctuaries. And those bishops and those bishops and the emperor together ruled and legislated, codified the new faith. And it was clear that Constantine would enforce those decisions and that he would reward the subjects of his who were adherents to the new faith. And there was now a new, fundamentally different relationship between the imperial government and its subjects. What counted in the world was not really even Roman citizenship, therefore, but Christian faith. And so what I want to do right now is to go kind of further with this idea and to deal with the implications of Constantine's activities from everything that I've been talking about today and our last time: his conversion, his construction of a Christian capital, his summoning of the Council of Nicaea. And I want us to kind of essentially deal with what I call the Christianization or the Christianizing of the Roman world and those regions immediately beyond the Roman world, because Constantine's efforts to promote Christianity were not only within the empire, but also among various allied and associated political powers beyond the imperial limes or limites, the frontiers, which came to mark the political and cultural barriers of the Roman world vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And that cultural barrier begins to lose its significance in the increasingly Christian world created by Constantine and his successors. So what we want to do right now is to look in particular at several related issues. First, we want to see how Constantine and the bishops claimed public spaces and religious spaces for the new faith, particularly in the classical, kind of the big cities. This represents a whole issue of turning urban landscapes increasingly from pagan ones into Christian ones. And this is a long process that begins now, but between the 4th century and the 6th centuries, where it becomes essentially completed under the time of Justinian, who rules between 527 and 565. Another related issue that we'll deal with is the whole social and economic change in the cities, where the bishops and the Christian emperor came to play a new role. And then we can turn and look at the issue of Christian pilgrimage and Christian missionary activities, which are two very important interrelated issues that tie in with the first subject, that is the changing of the classical world into a Christian world. And with these three issues in mind, let's take a look at what Constantine initiated by becoming a Christian emperor. So first of all, Constantine is behind the adaptation of the basilica. Now, the basilica was originally a Roman public building. It becomes, during the 4th century, the premier building for the construction of a church. Now, in our first lecture, I believe I mentioned the city of Sardis, where there's a synagogue that is essentially a remodeled basilica, a Roman public building in the city of Sardis that had been turned over to the Jewish community around 280 AD, and in some way acted as a model for the Christian Basilican Church. It's a precedent for that, but whatever the precedents may have been, Constantine was very clearly behind the creation of a new type of building that is distinctly Christian and religious and also Roman at the same time. And we call that the Roman Basilica, or the Roman style basilica. Now, the classical Roman basilica is a quintessentially Roman building. It is brick and concrete building with vaults, with various types of arches. It is a very vast enclosed space. You can see that from the ruins of what we see here. This one is from North Africa. But as a model, though, it comes to mark the typical premier Christian cathedral or Christian church. At the same time, though, besides creating this new ecclesiastical religious architecture, there is a subtle transformation of the public and religious space of many cities in the Roman world. And this is one of the benefits of the new faith. The way this was done varied from city to city. It varied from province to province. Archaeologists who work in different parts of the Roman world can each provide their own kind of story of how it was done. But suffice it to say, there is now a sort of increasingly very kind of understanding of the sort of characteristic broad changes that are going on across the Roman Empire that are given local accents, but are nevertheless all part of the same change. There are some exceptions in the northwestern provinces along the Rhine and Danube frontier, where Christians were still pretty much minority, or certainly they did not have the same impact as they did in the core lands around the Mediterranean world. But overall, the examples that I'm going to give you right now should pretty much serve for the entire Roman world. One of the most obvious examples is the city of Ephesus. Now, I spoke about Ephesus on several occasions. It is, of course, it was the center of the goddess Artemis Ephesia. It is where St. Paul tried to make some of his important conversions. The city of Ephesus was the first city of Asia, and with its cult of Artemis Ephesia, was recognized across the Roman world. Ephesus was granted Christian churches perhaps as early as the 4th century, certainly by the early 5th century. The church that we have today, which is associated with the Third Ecumenical Council, the Church of Mary the Theotokos, which you see in front of you, was actually built into a temenos wall colonnade of a previous larger sanctuary to Zeus. And when you see what is left of the church today, which, as I said before, is still being reconstructed, and when you stand at the apse and look down at the nave toward the courtyard, what you are seeing is part of a previous pagan sanctuary that had been taken over and remodeled as a basilican church. It is essentially on the floor plan of a much larger pagan sanctuary, as I say, the Temple of Zeus, which was essentially dismantled and the sanctuary then turned into a Christian church, where there is, you can still see kind of a lot of the spolia that have been used. That is, the parts of the previous structure that had been recycled and sort of taken down and put up in new places, taken down from earlier times. So, for instance, the pavement includes inscriptions and elements from various public buildings that have been laid down as a marble flooring to the large courtyard. And just to the north of that courtyard is a baptistry. The baptistries are usually built as circular buildings. They're very important in churches of the 4th and 5th centuries because there are enormous amounts of adult conversions taking place. And there is another one of the Church of St. John at Ephesus, which we will talk about later during the reign of Justinian. Basically, you have these kind of walk-in baptistries. So the kind of there's steps leading down into water where the baptizon would be baptized, and then steps leading up in the opposite direction where he would walk up as a new man. Now, the Church of Mary the Theotokos in Ephesus is a great example of the type of basilican churches that were constructed by Constantine and his sons throughout the empire. Many of these very early churches only survive in foundation, as you see, and this is particularly true with the city of Sardis, where we have that synagogue that is, as I say, kind of a precursor to various local Christian churches. In Sardis, there is also an early 4th century church, but it's only kind of in the floor plan that you still see that's left over. Unless someone tells you what you're looking at, you can easily pass it by. That church has not exactly been dated. Under the floor are coins in the 4th century AD, which date the church, I would think, securely to the middle of the 4th century. From what scholars have said. Again, Kenneth Harl, who works a lot with coins in Asia Minor, has dated it from between 348 to 354, based on the coins that were found there. And there are a number of these examples of churches, certainly some I can think of in Spain. And these basilican churches were constructed in prominent places. The Church of Mary the Theotokos at Ephesus is at the port, for example, in the city of Hierapolis, today Pamukkale in Turkey. We have a series of basilican churches on the axial road that runs north to south that connects the northern cemetery, where the pagan cemeteries are too, to the south end, and those churches are on the main road that you would take when you go through the city gate. And they are, in effect, replacing the Temple of Apollo, the so-called Plutonium. The Plutonium was a temple next to the Temple of Apollo. It apparently had various noxious gases, and animals, particularly birds, were sacrificed to Apollo by tossing them down into that subterranean chamber. And it was regarded as one of the openings into the underworld. That's why it's called that, Pluto, the god of the underworld. So what you get, though, is now the subtle placement of churches along highways in what I might kind of term an intercept policy. That is, as someone is coming into what was an originally pagan city, they are now immediately struck by the Christian churches at strategic points on the main roads. Or if they're coming in at the port, then they are struck by these churches as they come in there. And these divert the crowds away from the pagan sanctuaries. So this is very well seen at Hierapolis. And that is one way you can kind of claim public space, putting in these monumental basilican Roman-style churches at key points in cities so as to attract crowds. You're kind of drawn to the building. And there is another way, and this was one dictated in part by practicality of money, but also it was very effective, and that was to convert a temple into a church. We have, for instance, examples across the Roman world of this. I would just dwell on one in the city of Aphrodisias in Asia Minor. This is an extremely well excavated site. I mentioned it in an earlier lecture as a city that had a special relationship to Rome. It was a city, of course, you can tell by the name, devoted to the worship of Aphrodite. And really, Aphrodite here is just kind of a Greek version of a kind of indigenous or native earth mother kind of cult. Aphrodisias defied the laws of the emperors and continued to worship the goddess Aphrodite well into the 5th century. We know that. We know that they were in violation of the laws of Theodosius because of this. And we believe that the Emperor Zeno, the Byzantine emperor, finally cracked down on the city when it blundered into backing a rebel emperor, fellow named Elis, at the end of the 5th century as kind of a usurper. But anyway, the point is, what was done at Aphrodisias is indicative of how the Christians essentially claimed public and religious space in cities. They just kind of took over the local temple and took out the idols and blessed it, sprinkled everything with holy water, and then set up a church. Put in an altar and everything. The temple is a typical Greek temple, except it faces west rather than east. It's an Ionic style temple that is from the late 1st century BC. And what the Christians did was essentially build an apse at the east end. And at the west end, they moved the columns out to join the long colonnade on the north and south. They would build a narthex or entryway hall and then a courtyard, so that when you are looking at the temple, you see a courtyard, you see a narthex, and you have these columns. And then they built an outside wall and essentially turned the temple into a sort of basilican church, often with a dome. And what happens was the church sort of swallows up the temple. The colonnades, which were on the exterior of the temple of Aphrodite, now became the colonnades of the interior partition between the nave and the aisles. The columns on the short end have been moved to either lengthen the nave or to provide columns for the courtyard in the front. And the east end, in the east end, you have built an apse with what's called a synthronon, where the clergy would be seated. And what in effect you've done is rejiggered or reorganized this former temple, pagan temple, and now made it into a church. A perfect example of this can be seen actually in Sicily. I was there in my most recent trip to Italy in 2016, I believe, at the Cathedral Duomo di Siracusa in Sicily. And what you see here, so this is what it looks like from the outside. That's an 18th century facade. But then you walk into these doors here, and behind this grated fence in this area, it's actually all open. This is what it looks like behind that grated fence. And what you see here, this is actually from 5th century BC columns to the Temple of Athena. Okay, and beyond that is the full church. Syracuse obviously is was the churches there go back to very, very early times, but the temple, what they basically did was just what I'm describing in Aphrodisias, sort of built a sort of around and swallowed up the church, such that what had been the exterior columns of the temple now become interior columns of the cathedral. And just think about it for a moment. Let's go back to the example of Aphrodisias. For centuries, the pagans, particularly the people in the countryside, had come to the temple to worship on festival days. And that temple now had been built over. It originally was built over a spring. We know that from coin evidence from the reign of Tiberius, which depicts this. And it was oriented facing a sacred mountain west to the mother goddess, the indigenous Aetolian mother goddess named Ninue, later associated with Aphrodite. And now when pagans came to town, now they found a Christianization of that building, a Christianized version of that building. But they're still coming to the same space. The temple now, however, was within the larger building, and it was dedicated not to the goddess Aphrodite, but now to the new faith of Christianity. And there was this new building and this new faith. And that meant that the public and religious space of the city was now in the hands of the Christians. And one would imagine that instinctively many pagans would think, well, we need to find out about this. What is this? We've always worshipped here. What is this version of worship compared to what our forefathers had? And as a result of this, you have a number of these, what some might call temple conversions across the Roman world, where temples are converted into churches, and that precipitates the conversion of the local population around it. We have a number of very good examples of this from Asia Minor, where many leading temples were turned essentially into Christian churches in precisely this way. There were, however, several exceptional sanctuaries that were never turned into churches. And that is because they were too famous, in a sense. They were too important, perhaps, as pagan centers. One of them is the Temple of Artemis Ephesia at Ephesus, the Artemisium. This temple had always had problems. It was on the shore. There's earthquakes. It was a marshy era. It had burned down, supposedly on the night of Alexander the Great's birth. It was constantly being shored up with pilings. It had been damaged by the Goths in recent memory, recent in the sense of the 4th century memory. It had been rebuilt during the time of the Tetrarchic period and then repaired again. But the temple was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And uh, even though there had been calls for it to be dismantled, Christian calls for it to be dismantled, and actually there is only one full column still standing from the front. I guess there are these two there that behind. I think they've been put up in more recent times. So maybe three columns standing all together. It was never actually. It never was taken down. What the ravages that you see of it were all done just simply by processes of time and nature. Originally, there had been 128 columns all going around this massive temple, but that temple was essentially left when it was fallen down because of earthquakes and nature and so on. It was left as as sort of a, maybe you might call it a sort of memorial, or a sort of a reminder of the passing away of the pagan age. Okay, this thing that had been one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and now it was just a heap of rubble. It never was turned into a church. Across the Roman world, in the course of the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, temples did gradually give way to basilican churches, and basilican churches in time acquired bell towers. They had domes at their construction, and between the time of Constantine and the time of Justinian in the 6th century, cities of the Roman world increasingly acquired what we might call a Christian skyline. And that was a very significant move in converting the Roman world. And this changing of public and religious space was also paralleled by changes in social and economic life in the cities that I now want to talk about. I have mentioned before how Constantine gave various powers to the bishops so that they could emerge as leaders in provincial cities, and in many ways they replaced the old pagan decurions. There are a number of reasons why bishops emerged so quickly in the 4th and 5th centuries as such major figures, and let's think of it. One is that they had the greatest of patrons, that is the emperor, who had money that he gave to them freely. They, of course, were involved in construction of new churches and the conversion of temples into churches, and therefore they employed hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, as laborers as well as architects. They had to hire people to do the mosaics and frescoes. And we were talking really specifically about the types of this tremendous Christianization of the art of the classical world now. Okay, the physical art and aesthetics, which is something we're going to talk about even more later on today. You get types of arches that Christians favored in the 4th and 5th centuries that become more common. From a financial point of view, think of it: the Christian emperors made the bishops the font of patronage for the provincial cities. So there's a kind of a sort of a pyramid effect. And that alone meant that many pagan artists, artisans, architects, and laborers were now accepting largesse from the bishop to beautify or to indeed build these Christian churches. And many of them would have been induced to convert too. We have a monumental inscription from one such person, a man named Marcus Junius Eugenius, who was a bishop of the city of Laodicea, Combusta, from 315 to 340. He set up a monument in which he boasted how he turned his city into essentially a Christian city by architecture, by buildings. The inscription is very much similar to the types of praise that you would get from decurions of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, who were putting up pagan public buildings in the time of the High Empire. Activities by men such as Bishop Julius Eugenius, who actually had suffered under the persecutions and was elected bishop because of his piety. Activities of such men were very important in the social transformation of cities, as well as in the architectural transformation of them. Again, let's read the commentary of A.D. Lee. This inscription presents the interesting case history of a bishop in Asia Minor during the 4th century. Significantly, his family background was in the local elite. He spent a period of time in imperial service, most scholars assume in the army, though since militia could mean service in the civilian administration in late antiquity, this is an alternative possibility. By this stage, he was a Christian, and he duly suffered persecution at the hands of Maximinus Daya's associates. Subsequently, he went to live in the city of Laodicea in Phrygia. His place of origin may have been a village in that territory, where he was appointed bishop. In this capacity, he engaged in and advertised construction activities analogous to those which his non-Christian forebearers, the Decurions, might have been expected to do on behalf of their city in the times past. Let's just read this inscription. I, Marcus Julius Eugenius, son of Cyrillus Celer Cuesa, town councillor, Bouleutes, did military service in the office of the governor of Pisidia, and married Flavia Julia Flaviana, the daughter of the senator Gaius Nestorianus. I served with distinction, and during the period when the order was issued by Maximinus Daia for the Christians to sacrifice and not be released from the army, I stood firm through very many tortures at the hands of the governor Diogenes. I was eager to be released from the army and to defend the faith of the Christians. After spending a short time in the service of the Laodiceans, I was appointed bishop by the will of Almighty God and served with great distinction as bishop for 25 whole years. I rebuilt the whole church from its foundations and all the adornments around it, porticos, four-sided porticos, paintings, mosaics, a fountain, a gateway, and I put up all the stonework, in a word, everything. When I was about to depart this human life, I made a tomb and sarcophagus for myself, on which I had these words inscribed, for the enhancement of the church and of my family. However, some Christians deplored this sort of what they would call lithomania, just putting up buildings, all over the place. Some would maybe say that this was kind of getting too worldly, too much, too involved in the things of this world. Certainly what we're going to see in the future, shortly in the future, in the 4th century, is that with the great expansion of Christianity among a formerly pagan population, and with all of these enticements to become Christian, to convert to Christianity, you get a lot of people maybe who are opportunists, who are sort of seeing which way the wind is blowing, and they're going to be, maybe converting to Christianity for personal advancement, a way of careerism or something like that. And the reaction that we will see take place against this is monasticism, the birth of monasticism for those who truly want to live the Christian life in a way free from any kind of worldliness or any kind of, bourgeoisie respectability, and just go out into the desert to be alone with Christ. What, after all, could be better? And so we will see that there was a reaction against it, a Christian reaction against some of these developments. Others would see these same bishops as more than just putting up buildings, but as what a term that is used in Greek inscriptions, they are either tropheos or syntropheos. They are nourishers of the city. And that meant that in addition to doing all these building activities, they were looking to the social obligations that once characterized the pagan elites. Okay, so there is, there's going to be kind of a duality here, that there is going to be those Christians who do engage more fully with the wider pagan world, the urban pagan world, and those who withdraw from it. And that's a subtle distinction here in some ways. Pagan Decurions always gave out distributions at the festivals. That is in honor of the god or the goddess that was being celebrated. And those distributions were handed out by the Decurion class, the local worthies. The higher members of societies would give out gold coins and lots of goodies. Remember, we talked all about this. Whereas the lower members of society would get money and also meat, which they wouldn't ordinarily get to eat, and other things. Well, the Christian bishops aren't going to be doing this kind of stuff, obviously. They're not going to be just giving out money for the sake of aggrandizing themselves, throwing money around. But what we do see is the emergence of Christian charity, replacing the old kind of euergetism, or kind of like, self-serving philanthropy of the pagan Decurion class. Obviously, Christian charity is as old as Christianity itself. We read about this in the Acts of the Apostles, that the deacons would take care of the orphans and the widows of Jerusalem and so on, St. Stephen. But there's a distinction here, okay? There's a big distinction between pagan euergetism, of do-gooderism, kind of self-aggrandizing philanthropy, of giving out money for the sake of everyone saying what a great guy you were, and Christian charity. Obviously, Christian charity has its roots going back to the Hebrew Bible, where there are injunctions all over the place about the necessity before God to provide for the orphan and the widow, for those who have no one to take care of them, that the poor are special in God's eyes. This kind of charity is not directed simply at citizens. It is not directed to honor the donor, but rather it is an act of piety to the poor and destitute who need it. And above all, it is an act of piety to God. A whole new terminology, therefore, emerges in Greek. And there are 3 studies by Peter Brown that talk all about this, the titles of which are on the screen in front of you, where he really charts the major change that takes place here between Christian charity and the pagan self-aggrandizing philanthropy that it displaces. And basically what he deals with in these works is how almsgiving and charity of the 4th and 5th centuries represents a major social change from the types of public distributions at festivals in the pagan cities of the Roman Empire. Terms now such as the penetes in Greek, or the ptokoi, the destitute. The penetes are the poor, the ptokoi are the ones, literally are the fallen ones, the ones who are really down on their luck, the 10%, say, of the city who are living on the edge. These groups, and they could be pagans as well, by the way. Okay, in fact, what we're going to see is that when we get to the deal with Julian the Apostate, he'll in some of his letters, he literally says to some of his fellow pagans, the Christians are gaining in numbers because they take care of our people better than we take care of our people. He wanted to co-opt that. He wanted to kind of get pagan good works rolling, but of course it doesn't work like that. Okay, we'll explore that kind of misunderstanding later, but actions proceed from belief. One's belief affects the way one lives. Man is his faith. And so the reason why Christian charity exists is because of the metaphysical supernatural beliefs of Christianity, that God exists, God sees everything that we do, God loves human beings, and we have an obligation to love each other in God, and therefore to take care of the least of my brethren, as Christ says. So paganism never had such metaphysical suppositions, so of course paganism would never have such good works. The idea that you could just sort of get the good works and leave the metaphysical baggage at the door is a fatuous and silly thing to say, or a silly thing to believe. It's the same sort of thing, though, that one sees in modern day atheism. I remember listening to one of the 4 major new atheists that have mercifully now shrunk into total irrelevance, a man named Daniel Dennett, who's a philosophy professor from Texas. He basically says, yes, we want all those good works. We want the beautiful buildings, we want the beautiful architecture. We want the feeding of the poor, but just leave all that stuff about God, out of it. Come on. Well, that's just a totally silly way of thinking of things, and he should know better as a philosophy professor. These groups of the poor now became attached to the bishops and to the churches of the city, and they lived on that charity. That charity was an expression of Christian piety, organized by the bishops and enacted by those Christian communities who often donated anonymously. Okay, that's the whole essence of Christian charity. As Christ says, do not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, because what your Father sees you do in secret, he will reward you for openly. Do not sound a trumpet when you give your alms, because what you do before men, I tell you, verily, you have your reward before men. In other words, when everybody speaks well of you, that's your reward. You don't have a reward if you have that in heaven. If you don't have a reward in heaven if you act like that. So, and the anonymity of Christian charity is really so essential. And this is a very big difference from the kind of public distributions that we had in the pagan world hitherto, and where we know that receiving a sum of money, was a major part of a rich person, a decurion class person, a major way of giving, kind of aggrandizing themselves. We have an oration from Dio Chrysostom, an orator of this time in the 2nd century, who was in effect, which is in effect an indication that you got the money because you were a citizen and not a non-citizen. So he basically says that this is one of the perks of being a citizen of that such and such a municipality. And what now has happened was that the social hierarchy that had now been adjusted to reflect the piety of the Christian leadership and charity and almsgiving was that now it was a sign of piety, and it went to those who really needed it, who were destitute, whether they were a citizen or a non-citizen, whether they were pagan or Christian. The poor, by virtue of their poverty, were deserving. They were members of that wider human race. And of course, no doubt they would be enticed thereby to also embrace the Christian faith. But these two things are inextricably linked. And this is a significant change in the social life of the cities of the Roman Empire. And there were other important changes too that I mentioned earlier on that sort of feed into the social and architectural changes of cities. And one of those is pilgrimage. Pilgrimage routes, in effect, changed the Roman world from the time of Constantine onwards. In the time of the pagan Roman Empire, before Constantine, there were great oracles. There were great international shrines like those of Ephesus or Delphi. There were great festivals that attracted visitors and spectators from cities all over the world, the Mediterranean world. At the very least, a local or regional festival brought in people from the countryside. We have poems from Ovid that talk about this, about going to visit certain shrines and really getting a kick out of the dancing and the sacrifices. I'm sure there was tremendous hullabaloo, and it no doubt would have been an attraction for people from all over the place. Now, however, certain sanctuaries, certain places important to the Christian faith, emerged as pilgrimage centers. And these had very little relationship, in many cases, to any of the big urban centers that had previously been pagan sources of visitation. The most obvious one is the Holy Land. Saint Helena, the mother of Saint Constantine, after a lot of troubled problems in the family of Constantine between 326 and 327, we talked about before with the unfortunate death of Crispus, and then the stepmother Faustina. She made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She went to Jerusalem, and she found the true cross, which had been buried up until that point. She carried out operations of what we might call Christian archaeology to find it, and she made efforts to find the places that had been associated with the events of the gospel. She stayed in the Holy Land from 326 through 328 and is responsible almost single-handedly for initiating a whole process whereby Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Mount Sinai, which became the center of St. Catherine's Monastery, one of the most important monasteries today in the Orthodox world, and a place where some of the earliest icons are still housed from earliest Christianity. She initiated this whole process of turning these locations into sites of pilgrimage, where Christians from all over the Roman world would trek to see the places where Christ was born, to pray there, to see the place where the Lord was crucified, to see the place of the resurrection, and of course to venerate the true cross, which was still intact up until the early 7th century, when it was smuggled out during the Arab attacks and then divided up into pieces during the Middle Ages. We have very good reports on the development of pilgrimage sites and the Holy Land and the finding of relics. One of the I'm sorry, got a little bit lost up there. Now, the region of what the Romans called Palestine, today, what is essentially Israel, the West Bank, parts of Lebanon. And again, I'm not making any kind of political statement by using that term. That is simply the Roman name for the province, as I said before. That whole region, which was the cradle of Christianity, and indeed the cradle of Judaism, that whole area experienced an enormous economic boom because of the pilgrimage, because of pilgrimages that began to become very, very popular at this time, and which would continue, obviously, well into the Middle Ages, on right up and until our own day. I've made 2 pilgrimages myself to the Holy Land and to Mount Sinai, and indeed to St. Catherine's Monastery. There were other sites that were developed along the pilgrimage routes, some of them in Italy, some in the Balkans, particularly in Asia Minor. One of the most famous sites is the site of Saint Thecla. She was the first reported in the Gospel of St. Paul and St. Thecla. This is a 2nd century Gnostic text, but her tomb is near the modern city of Silifke, the ancient city of Seleucia. And it was regarded as a pilgrimage route, not, of course, on par with the Holy Land, but definitely a major site. We have a marvelous account of a Spanish nun who goes by the name of Egeria. There she is. Who has a very long and wonderful account of her various pilgrimages to the Holy Land and to this place. And she describes the church services there, and many other things. It's a wonderful account. I would definitely highly recommend reading the work of Egeria. It's part of the early Christian writers library if you care to find it. And the development of these pilgrimage routes were very important in redirecting the whole focus of the religious life of the Roman world to these new locations associated with the mission of the earliest Christians, and of course, with the events of the gospel, the events of the earthly life of Jesus Christ and of the early apostles. Besides pilgrimage within the Roman world, there were also missionary activities outside the Roman world. Constantine was the first emperor to initiate this with imperial backing. That is, to initiate missionary activities on a grand scale. And this had major consequences in several different ways. First of all, the sending of missionaries beyond the imperial frontiers to convert lands that were either allied or important to the Roman world changed the whole diplomatic and political dimensions of Roman foreign policy, or even frontier policy, whatever you want to call it. The earliest such kingdom is the kingdom of Armenia. There is an Armenian tradition that King Tiridates III embraced Christianity years before Constantine's own conversion. So that would make Armenia the first Christian nation, in a sense. And this conversion was initiated by Saint Gregory the Illuminator. It is a very famous story in the Armenian tradition. And in fact, Saint Gregory is depicted in a marvelous 10th century church of Agd Atmar on the island of in Lake Van, which is a medieval church in the 9th century. And in any case, these missions that were sent out, or it is more likely in my mind that the Armenians embraced Christianity. It is indeed very possible, I think, that this tradition is true, and that the Armenians actually embraced Christianity before Constantine. But Armenia, remember, is kind of sort of on the, it's outside of the Roman frontiers, really. It always occupied a kind of liminal space between Rome and outside of Rome. But by this point, it was very much on the outside of Rome. Nevertheless, it would have been the first of the nations to convert to Christianity en masse. We have other examples from the 4th century. The kingdom of Aksum, for example, in Ethiopia, also embraced Christianity sometime late in the reign of Constantine. What develops in Ethiopia is a very distinct version of Christianity. It's very closely linked to the Orthodox faith, but it refuses to accept the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century, and so in all the subsequent councils after that. So it actually cannot be considered Orthodox, but it is outwardly very similar to the Greek Orthodox faith, and it is a place that maybe one day I could even go to myself. I am very interested in seeing it. The Ethiopian Christians that I've met are very impressive people to me. Um, Certain various Arabian tribes along the frontiers between Rome and the Sassanid Empire, they too embraced Christianity. And in fact, I remember recently talking with a colleague of mine about Arabian Christianity, Arabic Christianity, and it is, although of course we always associate Arabic culture with Islam, the fact of the matter is that it wasn't until something like the 11th century that the majority of the Arabic world was Islamic. So, and there still are Arabic Christians to this day. Unfortunately, less and less of them because of all the terrible wars that have been going on in the Middle East and the martyrdoms that they've experienced at the hands of ISIS and indeed actually even being slaughtered by, sad to say, the American troops. Iraq was at one point, I think, over 10%. No, I'm sorry, it was much more than that. It was something like had 10 million Christians in it in Iraq. Many of those churches and holy places totally destroyed now, and many of them have either been killed or they've had to flee for their lives. Above all, missions were sent to the northern peoples. The most famous of these was a mission commissioned by the Emperor Constantius II, the son of Constantine, who found a bishop who knew the Gothic languages and who sent out missionaries to the northern peoples, to the Germanic peoples. And this fellow, whose name is Ulfilas, was responsible for creating the Gothic script. He adapted the Greek script in order to translate the Bible into Gothic. There's actually a version of this here in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And his efforts in the 4th century led to the conversion of the East Germanic peoples to Christianity. Now, keep your eye on this, because Constantius II, the son of Constantine, was an avowed Arian. Okay, Arianism did not disappear with the death of Arius after the Council of Nicaea in 325. Arianism was sort of pushed to the fringes, but there still were adherents to Arianism. And after the death of Constantine, one of Constantine's own sons embraced Arianism very fully. And so when the Goths and these other East Germanic peoples are converted to Christianity, it is to Arian Christianity that they are converted. Okay. And so that is a significant change. But keep your eye on it, because we're going to be hearing a lot more about the Goths in subsequent lectures. But what the point, though, to make here is that it is still a version of Christianity. And so as tribes across the imperial frontier were previously classified as barbarians, now by virtue of the fact that they are embracing Christianity, they become part of the wider community, part of what in the classical languages is referred to as the oikumene, the inhabited world of the Christian communities, Christendom, as it would later become known. The Western Germanic tribes, too, in time would come to embrace Christianity, but that was more of a case of the 5th century and 6th centuries after the breakup of the Western Roman Empire. The results of all these missions were significant in several ways. First of all, the barriers between Rome and the outside world were now crossed by these religious ties. Roman emperors, for instance, would intervene in Armenia as co-religionists, fellow believers, fellow Christians, against the Persian Shahs. You see, against the non-Christian Persians. Armenia, which in the classical age, in the time of the Roman Empire, leaned culturally and religiously had leaned far more to the Iranian world, now reoriented itself more towards Rome because of the bond of Christianity. In addition, emperors such as Constantine himself, as well as his successors, now waged wars in the interest of Christians living beyond the imperial frontier. One of the finest examples of this is a brief war in 421/422, when the armies of the emperor Theodosius II was fighting under the banner of the cross on behalf of the Armenians against the Persian Shah, and he won a very significant victory. While the war was very brief and it ended with a Roman victory, what is important about it, my point here, is that it was fought under Christian symbols and fought on behalf of Armenian fellow Christians who were living outside of the boundaries of the Roman world. The only reason why it was fought, therefore, was because of Christianity. So you see how the whole diplomatic foreign policy now begins to take on a very different cast, entirely under the influence of Christianity. And this meant that henceforward, the identity that determined one's citizenship or position in the Roman world was not primarily a legal identity. Are you a Roman citizen? But rather, are you a Christian? And the supreme irony in all of this is the fact that the Christianizing cities of the Roman world, particularly in the Roman West, and where you have the organization of the clergy around the bishops, which in many ways was a new Romanized Christian elite, and together with all the things I mentioned, the conversion of the various Germanic and barbarian peoples of Western Europe, all of this meant that when the Roman Empire in the West broke up in the 5th century, the potential catastrophe of it is greatly lessened, because the newcomers, even though it would be the Germans themselves that were responsible for the breakup of that's why I say the irony, the same people who would ultimately destroy the Western Empire. Nevertheless, because of the fact that there is this organization now, this very, very important social, economic, cultural organization around the church, the breakup and the potential catastrophe of it for society was greatly lessened, because those newcomers are those Germanic tribes are either Christians themselves, or at the very least they respect Christianity. They come to terms with the bishops. They recognize and respect the Romanized bishops as authorities in the provincial cities of the former Roman world. And those newcomers, as I keep calling them, the Germanic peoples, they come to an accommodation with them. And around those social and economic realities centered around the church, they create a new civilization, which is, of course, medieval Christendom. In this final portion now of the lecture for today, I want to deal with a further kind of expansion of this idea of the Christianization of the Roman world. We've looked at it in terms of politics, foreign policy, on the frontiers, and also through architecture. I want to go further with that idea and deal with the transformation of the Roman world through Christian visual arts and literary developments. And we're going to handle some of the issues of just how the Christians took over the classical heritage of their pagan past and made it distinctly Christian, and at the same time preserved a good deal of that pagan past, which of course has come down to us in the form of the classics with a capital C. In particular, the visual arts and the literary arts of pagan Greece and Rome, which were seen as fundamental for training Christian children and both males and females. Christian emperors played an important role in this, as did the clergy, the thinkers, and the artists themselves. And these groups interacted in a way to create a sort of new culture, and certainly a new set of visual arts, and also changes within literature. And what we'll do is concentrate right now, first of all, on the visual arts, and then sort of build upon the things that I've talked about earlier regarding how churches were used as a way of claiming public space and a way of kind of plugging into social and economic changes in the cities of the Roman world, and how those developments made those cities fundamentally Christian, really in a way kind of fully, completely Christian by the 6th century. And then we'll shift and we'll look more closely at what those churches were, what types of visual arts went on in them, what type of decorative arts were necessary to carry out the worship in the new imperial-backed church, as well as to instruct the many converts that were coming into Christianity with the conversion of Constantine. And finally, something that we should always stress, we will explore how these great churches were a way to inspire and awe the pagans, who in turn might consider Christianity and therefore might convert. Now, first of all, I mentioned the basilica. The basilica was originally a Roman civic building. The term is Greek. Actually, it originally designated, in effect, a palace The word basileos is the ancient Greek word for king. So basilikos or basilike in its feminine form would be the royal place. And but the Romans by the 2nd century BC had kind of adopted this term and created a type of public hall, a basilica, which could be used for law courts and administrative courts. And it was based on the fact that the Romans had mastered concrete and brick construction. It was an architecture of the interiors in what historians of architecture would like to call it, that is, with barrel vaults with various arches and domes. You could enclose a vast space like that. We have a number of basilicas that have come down to us, and one could wander in the one could wander in the Roman Forum and see the foundations of several from the Republic, most notably the Basilica Aemilia and the so-called Basilica Maxentius, which were later completed by Constantine. So sometimes they're called the Basilica of Constantine, but they do actually date back from an earlier period. All of these monuments were clearly available as prototypes for the Christian church. Furthermore, as I've mentioned before, there is the synagogue. And some scholars think that the synagogue in Sardis is much later, but still, though, it would have, it doesn't really matter. The same kind of type could be found elsewhere, and that also could kind of stand as something of a prototype, something of a forerunner for certain types of Christian architectural structures. But certainly, it is an example of how one could take a Roman public building and adapt it to worship. So there were a couple of important innovations to turn a Roman building into a basilica, that is, into a church. First was the orientation of the building. Churches in the Roman period, especially from the 4th century on and well into the Reformation, were always oriented facing to the east. You faced east because early Christians were obviously there was the idea of the light coming from the place of the rising of the sun, and the west is kind of symbolic of darkness. So you entered the church into from the west end, but you entered facing east. And the east end is where you traditionally would have the apse and the altar. In a Roman public building, such as the Basilica of Constantine or the Basilica of Maxentius, whatever name we apply to them, you usually came in on the long side. So there would be several doors, various entranceways. The basilica was a vast open space, and you had these various alcoves and areas where magistrates would have courts. In the pre-Christian version of the basilica, they would be courtrooms for administering justice, and you could go in there to present your petitions and so on. The church, however, was in a very different arrangement. So while the outer structure of the basilica was adopted, the inner life of it was changed. You came in on the west side, as I said, and you would walk into this vast hall, which is usually called the nave in a church. And at the other end, the Christians would have the apse where the altar is. So the worshiper is immediately drawn down the nave, and the attention is on the altar and the mysteries that are being performed there. Furthermore, Christian churches from a very early date also had aisles flanking that nave, and then the aisle would add eventually to what are called transepts. You would have subsidiary buildings, particularly baptistries, as I mentioned before, with the Church of Mary the Theotokos in Ephesus. The church, while a Roman building was a very different type of building in its feel, still coming in at the west end, your eye would be drawn immediately to the altar and to the sacraments there performed. And furthermore, at the end of the church was this apse where there was a set of seats known as the sunthronon. That is where the clergy would sit. There was a partition that usually cut them off from the rest of the congregation. So the altar is kind of behind this partition. This is in its later kind of manifestation, not much later, but during the Byzantine period, known as the iconostas, iconostasis, the kind of screen of icons that would separate the altar from the congregation. In addition, the church was illuminated by windows in the upper levels. Usually basilican churches were at least 2 stories or even 3 stories high. Furthermore, at various points in the church, particularly over what became essentially the transepts, that is the intersection of these side wings down towards the east apse, so that the church would assume the form of a cross in its plan, there would be a great dome, which came to be regarded as the dome of heaven, kind of, symbolic of the expanse of heaven. And the evolution of this basilican church in the 4th century was an extremely important turning point in Christian art and Christian architecture. For one, it provided the Christians with a building that was quintessentially Roman, and yet now also Christian. There was no mistaking the fact that where the Christians now worship was a Roman building in some capacity, yet it was now thoroughly Christian as well. And some scholars of architecture have even gone so far as to say that Constantine was the one actually behind the adaptation of the basilica into a church. And indeed, he very well might have been. That is a reasonable assumption to surmise. I really can't prove it per se, but it is a reasonable surmise. I'm thinking particularly of Ward Perkins, who is one of the great architectural historians of Rome. He argues this position. Well, in addition to the fact that the basilica is a Roman building, it is also an architecture of the interior, as I said. It accommodates a very different sort of worship from what we had seen in pagan temples. Pagan temples, as I stressed earlier, were essentially places of the god's statue, the places of the god's residence, really, and the cult statue would be the central focus, taken out during processions, and worship was very much public. When it was taken out, it would always end in the theater, where there was a great festival, sacrifices, donations, and so on. Christian services, though, were conducted inside, within the church, and that meant that Christian cities needed large numbers of churches and chapels to accommodate worship. If you had multiple services during the course of a Sunday, even that, of course, the ancient tradition still upheld in the Orthodox Church is that no more than one liturgy can ever be served on an altar during a single 24-hour period. So if you did have multiple services inside of a big cathedral, say, it would be with the smaller altars off to the side. But even if you did that, you would still have to have many churches to accommodate all of those hundreds of thousands of residents of the city. And therefore, there was a great surge in building basilican-style churches once a city moved over to the new faith. The basilica was ideally suited both as a place to hold worship inside, whereas a temple, a pagan Roman temple, was not. It was never intended to accommodate interior services like that. And secondly, it was this traditionally Roman building. There's another important building from the Roman tradition that was essentially a planned building, which is the dome on a square, or a circle on a square, epitomized by the Pantheon in the city of Rome, the temple that was rebuilt by Hadrian in the 120s, and is really one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, in my opinion, certainly in the city of Rome. The Pantheon was eventually converted into a church, and that type of circular building, in effect, that type of church was used for some, obviously, to accommodate many, many worshipers. One of the earliest one of the earliest examples of this, actually, of the taking over of a formerly pagan space and making it into a thoroughgoing Christian church in the city of Rome. In the Church of St. Philip the Evangelist in Hierapolis, the modern city of Pamukkale in Turkey, this church is built to a martyr saint, and very often churches to martyr saints, or martyria, were built in the form of some kind of centrally planned church. In the case of this one at Hierapolis, it's a kind of hexagonal plan that had a very impressive dome with flanking chapels. So in effect, you circle around the altar when you enter it, and you have several different directions from which you can enter the church. The church is actually positioned at a point overlooking the city of Hierapolis. It sits basically right next to an ancient spring that probably had a kind of pagan sanctuary attached to it. The water produces a kind of very salty mineral water that was probably used by ancients as kind of a healing sort of spa, but also pagan sanctuary. And this particular church was regarded as a way of Christianizing, again, a former pagan sanctuary. And this circular type of church was thought as particularly appropriate for martyr saints. And we believe that St. Philip may have been, the Church of St. Philip may have been constructed somewhere in the late 5th century, in the 470s or 480s. And it does really epitomize a whole class of churches, lesser churches, which were also constructed in the course of the 4th and 5th centuries. That form of circular church became very popular. It is rather technically difficult to build. We find it, for instance, produced in the art of the Georgian kingdoms. There is one in a place called Bana, a very early one, probably early medieval, the Georgian city of Bana, which is also now actually part of Turkey. And it follows very closely certain other types of patterns that we see in Rome for different martyr saints, also in Asia Minor. Basilican or centrally planned churches together were really a major achievement in which Christians adapted the architectural principles of Roman architecture to their own service, and in so doing created a religious architecture that was definitively Roman. And I keep stressing that. The way for the Christians to make their faith acceptable was, in this sense, to make it Roman. The architecture certainly would help to achieve that. Once one had the buildings, of course, you had to decorate them. It was a way of inspiring and awing the worshipers, all, of course, producing in the true kind of sense of wonder and fear mixed together, inspiring one in a proper devotional sense. And I mentioned all this in passing, and something that I mentioned rather in passing before. Oftentimes there would be frescoes or scenes, mosaics on the walls of Christian iconography. Oftentimes this took the form of Old Testament scenes that had prefigured certain things fulfilled in the New Testament. So, for instance, the sacrifice of Isaac, which had always been interpreted by the earlier church fathers as being a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Christ, the Father bringing the Son to the hill, where the Son carries the wood and of course Isaac asks his father, "Behold, Father, here we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb?" And Abraham says, "God himself, my son, will provide a lamb." And of course, we all know the story that as Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac, an angel appears and tells him not to. And he looks up and he sees a ram caught by the horns inside of the thicket. And the fathers of the church, I'm thinking particularly of St. Augustine, interpreted the fact that it was a ram and not a lamb, to be highly significant, because remember, Isaac had asked, "Where is the lamb?" And Abraham says, "God himself will provide the lamb." But it is not a lamb that he provides at that moment. The lamb that God will provide, of course, is Jesus Christ, who God himself will provide the lamb, and because he is God himself. This sort of typological scene, one can think of also how Christ compares himself. No sign will be given to this generation except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days inside of the beast, the fish of the sea, the great whale, as it's often called, so will the Son of Man be 3 days inside of the earth. And so these various different scenes in the Old Testament that prefigure New Testament fulfillments would oftentimes make up the kind of iconography on the walls of these early churches. The Christians used several different important media to convey these messages of worship. One was sculpture, particularly relief sculpture, and a very limited amount of freestanding sculpture has been found by archaeologists. Of course, Christians were reacting to aesthetic changes that characterized all sorts of developments in the later Roman world. Even among pagan artists and Roman emperors after 235 AD, stressed in art hierarchy, symmetrical presentations, presenting of figures so as to convey a message or to inspire a sense of awe or some sort of respect rather than realistic imagery. This transfers over into Christian iconography too. Imperial portraits, for instance, became increasingly stylized. The hairstyle, the eyes enlarged. These were abstract and symmetrical depictions one finds on coins, for instance. And in the 4th century, the images of the elite classes that serve the emperor. For instance, there is a whole array of sculptures of imperial officials of the 4th and early 5th centuries from the city of Aphrodisias, which really characterizes a general trend in late antique arts, whether it be public or religious, whether it be Christian or pagan, and which gives some sense of where the aesthetics of classical arts were moving by this late period of antiquity. The Christians, clearly now recognized and given favor by Constantine, and then eventually becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, utilized these aesthetic traditions, these developments to decorate their own churches. And you can see this especially in Greek Orthodox icons. A lot of these kind of more stylized representations become very characteristic of early icons. One way of doing this was to essentially adapt mosaics and frescoes to the decorations of the ceilings and the walls of Christian churches. This was a major innovation in the arts. In the classical period, mosaic work tended to be floor mosaics. Anyone who has visited some of the classical sites in Rome, or you can see them in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan. They have a wonderful floor mosaic from the Near East. There's also very nice specimens from North Africa. All of these cities around the Roman world had mosaics based on representational art. Some of them are clearly inspired after painting, a type of painting that would stress realism and perspective, which we know, of course, was capable of being produced in classical art. What those floor mosaics were a way of displaying one's own opulence in classical houses, as well as one's good taste. Oftentimes they depicted mythological scenes, and they would have hunting scenes, scenes from daily life even. And therefore, floor mosaics or even wall mosaics are done with various types of stones and tesserae, tiles. And the idea was to create something of a kind of overwhelmingly brilliant visual image. Christians, however, took the mosaics and put them on ceilings, and as well as on the floors and on the walls. Their intention was not to stress the realism, but the message. And that message was, of course, always highlighted by certain conventions that had by now been applied to mosaics and frescoes in the classical tradition. One was elongating the figures, enlarging the eyes, as I've said, stylizing those figures so that they would be seen from above, and they would loom impressively, larger and grander than if you were merely looking at them at eye level. In addition, for the mosaic work was usually done in roughly cut stone. There was often a background in gold or gold leaf. All of this was intentional. It was not because they had lost the ability to do realistic mosaics, but it was done because those types of surfaces scattered light better throughout the church. And as the light came through the windows in the upper levels of the church, or often through the windows of the dome, this would, and you can see this very well in Hagia Sophia, this means that the light is bounced off and scattered and refracted, and it gives very dramatic effects within the interior of the church where the services are held. Not only were the mosaics put to use depicting messages from the Christian scriptures, juxtaposing Old and New Testament scenes, working out in iconography that could instruct the illiterate, to use Martin Luther's phrase. Icons are sermons for the eyes, but they would also be part of the whole drama of the building and the worship within the building. And this led to a really well-developed sense of Christian aesthetics, this beautiful church services being evolved over the course of the 4th century. And of course, one can still get that experience, particularly in Greek Orthodox churches, Orthodox churches in general, Greek, Russian, whatever, conducted in the traditional ancient rites, the ancient liturgies of St. John Chrysostom. And you can see that decorative style. Frescoes too were used for decoration, and very often frescoes were used either out of monetary concerns, because mosaics were so much more costly, or more often the fact that the surface lent itself to painting rather than mosaics, as many churches show a combination of frescoes and mosaics. But the intent is still the same no matter what medium is chosen, and it was part of an overall program to instruct and to impress the worshiper. And I suppose if you want to go further with it, the underlying sort of theology behind it all is the fact that our bodies are part of ourselves. We are not just souls. We are souls and bodies. And so therefore worship must be physical as well as spiritual. This is something, of course, that Protestant reformers would object to entirely. It is why Protestant churches are essentially just rooms with no attempt at aesthetics at all. Rather, the ancient Christian understanding, the genuine Christian understanding, has always been that sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch all have to be incorporated into the worship of Almighty God. The incense, of course, for the smelling, the beautiful singing of the liturgy, the frescoes and mosaics for the sight, and of course the tasting of the sacraments and other blessed breads and wine and so on, and the kissing of icons, and and of all, incorporating the touch, the physicality as well as the spirituality of worship has always been a quality of Christianity, always been fundamental to Christianity. In fact, the only thing that one could compare the sort of Protestant sort of bodiless or physicalless, the lack of physicality in worship that is so characteristic of Protestantism, is the Gnostic sects of ancient times, where everything is cerebral, everything is mental, and there is no physicality at all. Well, as I mentioned, the changes in sculpture and relief sculpture, which you see in pagan and public arts, were only partially adopted by Christians. From the start, the Christians were a little bit reluctant about using freestanding sculpture because it looked very much like cult statues. And there was this tendency to go for rather two-dimensional decoration. And this is an issue that will be later debated in the 8th and 9th centuries during the so-called iconoclastic controversies. In terms of Christian arts, though, by the opening of the 5th century, both architecture and visual arts had been put into the service of the new faith in a very new and distinctly Christian way, a very successful way. Okay, that does not mean that the classical arts disappeared, though. Far from it. In fact, in the private villas of individuals who were known to be Christians, but who were also clearly of high rank, such as the slope houses of Ephesus and probably the mosaics of the so-called Great Palace of Constantinople, they show that well into the 6th century and probably the 7th century, many Christian families in private art still preferred classicizing art. Okay, so this is not liturgical art now. We're just talking about having, stuff in your house. And they still preferred sculptures and statues and decorative furniture and the like, all the furnishings, the ornamenta, which would resemble very much the decorative arts and furnishings and even the wall paintings and floor mosaics of a classical villa of, say, the 2nd century AD. So it is important to stress that even though there are these innovations in terms of Christian art, we still do see traditional art continuing both in the pagan world and even in the Christian world too, just in a private capacity. In addition to the visual arts, there were some very important changes that went on in literary arts at the same time. And we will return to this idea later on when we discuss the Cappadocian Fathers, and specifically a piece of writing that is so important, known as it is a document written by St. Basil on how young people can be benefited by studying pagan literature. But right now, I'll just kind of give you some sort of introduction to the changes that occurred in terms of the aesthetics of literary arts. Again, this was brought about by the fact that the Christians were now being put in charge of the civilization. No longer were they just a small persecuted minority, but are now changing the entirety of civilization. They had the Emperor Constantine and his sons who were backing the bishops. Christianity is certainly no longer an illegal sect, writing literature by the Christians for Christians, therefore, um, it was not just for the Christians anymore. It was now the writing of a literature that had a much wider application and a much wider cultural implication, therefore, because increasingly the Christians were coming to take over the cultural leadership of the Roman world. And this requires us to look a little bit both before and after the moment that we're in right now and put some of the authors that I've talked about from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD in context with what happens after the conversion of Constantine, that is, after the 300s AD. Let us look back for a moment, starting with St. Paul. Christians perfected one literary form right from the get-go. That is the epistle, the letter. Letters were a common part of communicating. Writing, of course, a very fine letter was certainly the hallmark of a pagan gentleman. Those who studied Latin, for instance, knew Cicero's letters. Pliny the Younger, of course, has left us a very, very large collection of his letters, as well as a whole book of them to the Emperor Trajan. And we also have letters from Seneca, the philosophical epistles addressed to one Lucilius. Starting with St. Paul, and then again with St. Ignatius, the first bishop of Antioch after St. Peter, who penned 7 very important letters around 107 AD. The Christians really evolved a very successful way of communicating with other leaders and congregations over questions of church discipline and theology and so on. The letters of St. Paul were actually the prototype for a whole tradition of Christian epistolary exchanges and epistolary literature. Another area that they excelled in was the Platonic dialogue, that is the setting up of a debate over theological issues. This was a genre that is very well represented in the classical tradition. The master, of course, was Plato, but it was used also by many philosophers writing in both Greek and Latin. Cicero is the biggest example of this, the master of this in Latin. And there were also other successors to Plato, the Middle Platonists who wrote in dialogues, usually a debate between individuals, sometimes groups of individuals where you can have different interlocutors. You know, if you've read any of Plato, the Republic or the Timaeus, this type of form was adapted by the first Christian authors, notably the apologists. Theophilus of Antioch, we've referred to, made use of this technique. His apology is an odd combination of both letter and Platonic dialogue. The same is true of the first apology of Justin, which is in the form of a very long letter to the Emperor Antoninus Pius. Christian apologists writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, in Greek principally, began to really pioneer the use of the dialogue as a way of investigating theological issues. And of course, in Africa, that is in the Roman province of Africa, essentially around the area of Tunisia today, some of the earliest Christian Latin writers in the end of the 2nd century and opening of the 3rd century did some marvelous pieces, the most famous of which is Minucius Felix, probably writing in the middle of the 2nd century AD, and one of the earliest apologists. I discussed him already in the context of answering pagan criticisms, but his Octavius, as an apology, is really a dialogue. In fact, in some ways, it resembles the dialogues of Plato, but in Latin, Cicero, and there's also a famous dialogue of Tacitus on orators. What Minucius Felix does, though, is he takes that style, that genre, and he essentially invents a debate between a Christian Octavius and a pagan named Caecilius over the virtues of the Christian faith and how it fits into philosophy, and of course, the Christian wins. It is a very interesting work, and a work that shows some very impressive polished Latin style. And it is the first significant Christian work in the Latin language in some ways. Tertullian, who writes in the apology genre, tended to go along the lines of Cicero's Philippics, that is, kind of vehement polemic. But he was also one of the first to do write in the genre of exegesis, that is the explaining of biblical text, writing commentaries on biblical texts. And by the time of the early 3rd century AD, the Christians had made the epistle, the dialogue, and the philosophical debate, whatever you want to call it, and exegesis or analysis of and commentary on text, all of them they had made their own. Unfortunately for the Christians, in terms of propagating the message of Christianity, missionizing, um, initially, in terms of pagan intellectuals, they didn't seem to find much interest among a lot of the pagan intellectuals. Christian letters really came of age, though, with Saint Clement and Origen. When I say letters here, I mean Christian literature came of age really with Saint Clement and Origen, as I discussed them in some detail with their theology. And the only point I wish to stress at this moment is that both Clement and Origen made philosophy and Christian theology, expressing Christian theology in philosophical terms. They took that and made it into a serious genre, so that by the time of the 4th century AD, Christian theology and Christianity in general had to be taken seriously by pagan critics. Already, as we've seen, the pagan Porphyry, a critic, very vehement critic of Christianity, by the end of the 3rd century, was answering point-by-point arguments made by Origen. With Clement and Origen, at least Christian literature leapt to a kind of new height, and henceforth Christians writing in Greek were trained, obviously, in the high Attic style of Plato, the polished language of that was written in the Second Sophistic, and they were turning out works that the pagans could no longer dismiss as simply being, oh, that's illiterate gobbledygook. That's not worthy of serious intellectual consideration. They had to take it seriously. Latin literature would come of age a bit later. It really doesn't come about until the age of Saint Augustine, in which you could say Lactantius definitely to some degree, but Saint Augustine really does bring it to a whole new level a century later in the late 4th and early 5th century, in which one sees the flourishing of a new Christian Latin literature, and of course Greek Christian literature, definitely all throughout the 4th century, is being read by pagans who have been trained in the classics, and they have to, on some level, respect it and appreciate it, even if they disagree with it. And this meant that there were new genres that were springing into use by the Christians. So one of them, which had no real pagan precedent for it, was the sermon. There are many writers who kind of bring the sermon, obviously, to a height that is just absolutely staggering. Particularly, I'm thinking of Saint John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople. He wrote a series, just absolutely volumes of sermons. They're essentially orations in a sense. They're almost kind of in the Demosthenic, Ciceronian kind of style, but he presents a very, very powerful presentation, both an exegesis of the scriptures, but also an address to the worshipers, that is really something kind of unique. It is very much and exclusively in a Christian context, and therefore it's really it has to be understood not just as a continuation of the classical oration, but really a whole new genre being created. And indeed, this would produce educational different distinctions too, trends in education, where young men would be trained in the use of classical oratory, but for the specific purposes of writing sermons. This would be part of the training of the priesthood in time. There was also the development of Christian biography and Christian history. Now, we've already seen this with Eusebius, who was one of our principal sources for this whole course up until this point, and he pioneered both. I have discussed how Eusebius created the narrative of Christian history in his ecclesiastical history, and that becomes the basis for medieval chronicles. But he also wrote a life of Constantine, which becomes a model for both Christian monarchy in the Middle Ages and also, in some ways, hagiography, the lives of the saints. He also wrote a very important work known as the Tricennial Oration, which is a Christian panegyric that praises a Christian ruler, and at the same time is, in a very clever way, forces Christian rulers to think just in what tradition they are following, which of course is to say it is the tradition of the old Israel, the righteous kings of the Old Testament, Hezekiah, and of course Josiah and David. These were very common parallels that would be drawn upon starting in Constantine's reign and going right on up through the Middle Ages, even beyond the Reformation. Finally, with a saint such as Saint Athanasius the Great of Alexandria, a brilliant theologian and just a very intrepid personality. If you've read the book, the second book for the book report, you know all about him. He was Patriarch of Alexandria from 329 to his death in 373, and wrote a biography of Saint Anthony, the great ascetic. And he, of course, is in some ways the originator of the hagiography, the sacred biography of the saints, one of the most popular genres of the Christian medieval world. In the course of the 4th century, we add to the literary arts of the 3rd century works with much wider appeal: the sermon, the hagiography, the biography, the writing of more letters and of theological tracts in serious terms. We're going to learn all about the Cappadocian Fathers soon, and of course Athanasius's theological works. So that by the opening of the 5th century, looking ahead, the Christians had evolved a form of literature for their purposes that was both serious and intense, had a high degree of sophisticated language, both Latin and Greek, and could not simply be dismissed, as I say, by their pagan competitors and contemporaries as the language of a lowbrow movement, a superstition. It was very important, these developments are very important to mark the coming of age, really, of Christianity in terms of its cultural impact. And finally, just to kind of bring things to a close, there is one other point I want to stress. In creating this literature, just as in the creating of the visual arts, the Christian authors drew very heavily on the classical past. In terms of literature, all of these authors that I've been talking about were trained in Homer and Plato, in the Greek historians and Demosthenes. If they were writing in Latin, they had been trained in Virgil. They were trained in the writings of Cicero. St. Augustine was an impeccable Ciceronian in terms of his Latin. The same was true of St. Jerome, St. Ambrose of Milan, and in time, St. Gregory, the theologian. All of these authors had a very fine classical education. And the two long-term implications of this for the Roman world meant that the classics, with a capital C, that is, the pagan literary traditions, would be preserved and transmitted to later generations by the Christian successors to this pagan world that they had now transformed. Pagan authors would not be denounced in total and renounced and rejected. Certainly there would be a reevaluation of their role and of their value system, but there was certainly no all-out renunciation, burning of texts, because it contained pagan ideas. None of that. Rather, what one sees is an enormous cultural continuity, a literary and visual continuity, which goes from the pagan world into the Christian world. With changes, with adaptation. We're not talking about slavish copying here, nor are we talking about all-out utter rejection and denigration. And the second important point in all of this that I'm talking about is that unintentionally, these Christian authors and writers and thinkers gave the Western tradition a very distinct dynamic, because hereafter the canonical texts of the Western tradition were not only Christian or even Jewish, but also included a large body of pagan literature that in and of itself was totally independent of the Christian message. And yet, it was one that became welded or kind of fed into as a kind of, secondary source for the entire basis of Western culture, the Western literary tradition, and certainly accounts for some of the most dynamic and unusual aspects of the Western literary tradition down to our day. And if I were to just avail myself of a sort of metaphor from the sciences, I would say that everything that I've been talking about now, this wonderful merger of the classical with the Christian, both in terms of aesthetics, architecture, archaeology, literary stuff, aesthetics, and as we'll see also, and we have seen some of already with the legal, the transformation of the laws of the ancient world. This duality of taking all of those great achievements of the Greco-Roman world and giving them now a decisively Christian cast, this produces as I said, if I were to avail myself of a scientific image, the kind of double helix of Western civilization. That is, Christianity and the classics, the classical inheritance, are both fundamental strands within the DNA of Western civilization. You cannot have Western civilization with all the things that we value and that we cherish, and which indeed the rest of the world looks to as being the high point of civilization, as evinced by the fact that so many millions of non-Western peoples flock to our countries every single year to enjoy the fruits of that Western civilization. This all comes about only and exclusively by the merger of this amazing tradition of Western, of pagan or classical our inheritance with the Christian inheritance. And we will be examining much more of that as time goes on in subsequent lectures. So at this point, I think we should put a bookmark in it, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you.